Hey everyone, today we're opening a 1960s pantry where the paper grocery bag has just landed on a Formica counter. The electric can opener is waiting beside the wall outlet, and a neat row of red and white soup cans stands behind the flour and sugar canisters. For many American families, condensed soup was more than something poured into a bowl on a cold afternoon. It was a shelf-stable promise that dinner could still happen when the meat was limited, the children were hungry, and the refrigerator contained half an onion, a little milk, and several containers nobody wanted to investigate too closely. Not every household stocked the same brand or flavor, and many families relied more heavily on homemade soup, regional ingredients, or home-canned foods. But in countless suburban, rural, and working-class kitchens, a can of condensed soup became one of the most adaptable objects in the cabinet. It could be lunch, sauce, gravy, casserole, binder, or the beginning of a meal that looked far more planned than it really was. Before we reach for the can opener, please like and subscribe if you enjoy remembering the foods, grocery habits, kitchen rules, and family traditions that once shaped the American home. Which condensed soup do you remember seeing most often in your family's pantry? And what meal did your mother, grandmother, father, or another family cook make with it? For this list, a pantry staple is not simply a product that existed in the 1960s. It is something families repeatedly bought because it solved a real household problem. It kept well-stretched other ingredients, reduced preparation time, or rescued a meal when the week became more complicated than the grocery list expected. The first staple is condensed soup, and the familiar Campbell's can provides the clearest picture, though it was never the only choice on the shelf. Condensing removed much of the water, allowing a smaller can to wait in the pantry until the cook restored it with the water or milk. By the 1960s, the red and white label was already deeply familiar, and the sound of the opener cutting around the metal lid was often followed by a soft, reluctant slide as the thick soup left the can. Tomato soup loosened into a smooth orange-red bowl beside grilled cheese. Chicken noodle offered quick comfort on a sick day. Cream soups entered a different category entirely. They were less a finished meal than a kitchen tool ready to coat noodles, vegetables, rice, potatoes, chicken, or tuna. The label might have said soup, but the family recipe box often understood it as sauce. One can could stand between an organized supper and the announcement that everyone would be eating sandwiches again. That flexibility mattered because feeding a household required more than knowing how to cook. Someone had to predict appetites, school schedules, paydays, unexpected visitors, changing prices, and the possibility that a child would suddenly refuse the food he had eaten cheerfully the previous Tuesday. A pantry can reduced a few uncertainties. It kept well-demanded no chopping, and could make a modest quantity of meat or vegetables feel more complete. In a glass baking dish, condensed cream soup could surround egg noodles and tuna beneath crushed crackers. It could cover chicken before it went into the oven, moisten leftover turkey, or turn canned green beans into something suitable for company. Magazines, newspaper food pages, company booklets, and product labels encourage cooks to see the can not as a shortcut to hide, but as a modern ingredient. The convenience was real, although the advertisement rarely mentioned the bowl-spoon baking dish counter and can opener that still needed washing afterward. Progress had agreed to help with dinner, but not with cleanup. The mother who kept several cans on hand was also keeping options. A tomato-based soup could become a quick sauce or add body to a meat dish. A cream soup could hold a casserole together when there was not enough cheese gravy or thyme. A broth-based variety could begin lunch with crackers and a glass of milk. The can was especially useful near the end of the shopping week when fresh ingredients had dwindled and the pantry had to take over. Open the door, and there it was, sitting upright with the calm confidence of an object that knew it would eventually be needed. Families watching every dollar could combine one can with noodles, rice potatoes, vegetables, or leftover meat to make several portions. Others used the same soups because they were familiar and predictable. Convenience foods crossed class lines, but they did not mean the same thing in every kitchen. For one household, the can saved time. For another, it stretched money. For many, it did both. Condensed soup also belonged to a larger change in the American kitchen. Food manufacturers had spent decades developing recipes around packaged products, and Campbell's had opened professional test kitchens long before the 1960s. By the time the decade arrived, home cooks were surrounded by tested suggestions showing how a branded can could become a family dish. That guidance appealed to women expected to produce meals that were economical, attractive, dependable, and different enough to prevent complaints often every day. The can offered consistency. Homemade white sauce could scorch separate or require ingredients that were running low. Condensed cream soup opened with the same thickness each time. That reliability appealed even to skilled cooks capable of making sauce from scratch. Using a convenience product did not prove that a woman had forgotten how to cook. More often, it proved that she understood the clock, the budget, and the patience level of the people waiting at the table. Today, condensed soup is still sold, so this is not a story about a product that vanished. What changed was its authority inside the pantry. Fresh and frozen choices expanded. Takeout became easier to obtain microwave meals, multiplied household sizes shifted, and many cooks moved away from recipes built around a canned cream base. Yet the memory remains powerful because the can was attached to ordinary scenes: soup cooling beside a child home from school, a casserole carried under foil to a church basement, a quick supper prepared before an evening meeting, or a cupboard inspection just before payday. The red and white can could not truly become anything. It only seemed that way when an experienced cook opened it beside noodles, leftovers, and a wooden spoon. One shelf over, however, waited a jar and a wax paper sleeve that required even less preparation: peanut butter and saltine crackers, ready for lunches that needed no stove at all. The peanut butter jar usually waited where a child could see it, and an adult could reach it without moving 3 other cans first. By the 1960s, many American pantry shelves held a familiar glass jar with a bright label, a metal lid, and either a smooth spread or the crunchy kind that could turn one family's preference into a surprisingly serious debate. Peanut butter needed no stove, no saucepan, and no advanced planning. A knife went into the jar, bread came out of its wrapper, and lunch was already halfway finished. In homes where mornings began with alarm clocks packed, school bags missing shoes, and someone announcing that the bus was coming, that reliability mattered. The spread was rich, salty, slightly sweet, and stubborn enough to cling to the roof of the mouth. It also clung to the knife, the edge of the bread, and occasionally the outside of the jar where one greasy fingerprint could remain, until somebody finally wiped the shelf. Names such as Jif, Skippy, and Peter Pan were already familiar to many shoppers, although store brands and regional labels also occupied pantry space. Advertising often presented peanut butter as wholesome, energetic, and especially suitable for children, but the person packing the lunchbox understood its more practical advantages. It spread quickly, kept well, and could make a filling sandwich without using meat cheese, or anything that had to stay cold for the entire school morning. Jelly made the sandwich sweeter and helped soften the dense spread, though it also created a bright line of purple or red that could escape through the bread and stain a wax paper wrapper. Some families added honey-sliced banana or nothing at all. Others spread peanut butter on toast for breakfast, tucked it between crackers. After school, stirred it into cookies, or let a child eat a spoonful while dinner was still an hour away. The jar was not glamorous, but it was unusually good at preventing a small hunger from becoming a household emergency. The peanut butter sandwich also revealed the quiet labor hidden inside something called an easy lunch. someone still had to notice that the bread was running low. Remember which child disliked grape jelly wash. The knife between sandwiches, wrap each one. Find the correct lunchbox and decide whether the apple with the bruised side could survive until noon. A thermos might hold milk or soup, but peanut butter asked for no insulation and made no threat of leaking through a loose cap. That made it useful not only for school children, but also for adults carrying lunch to a factory office construction site, farm field, or long shift behind a store counter. Household patterns differed widely, and peanut allergies were not discussed or managed in the same public way they would be decades later. Still, for families who used it, peanut butter occupied a rare position. Children recognized it, adults trusted it, and the grocery budget could usually explain why another jar had appeared in the cart. Saltine crackers waited nearby, often inside a rectangular box with the crackers divided into inner sleeves that tried their best to protect them from humidity, careless hands, and the general disorder of a family pantry. Opening a fresh sleeve produced a dry paper crackle and a faint floury smell. The crackers were square, pale, lightly salted, and fragile enough to leave crumbs in a lap before the first bite was finished. They appeared beside bowls of tomato soup, chicken noodle soup, and chili, but they were equally useful when there was no soup at all. A smear of peanut butter turned 2 saltines into a tiny sandwich. A slice of cheese made them feel more substantial. Crumbled crackers thickened or topped certain casseroles, while a few plain ones might be offered to a child with an unsettled stomach. They were the pantry's quiet supporting actor, rarely praised, frequently present, and somehow capable of scattering evidence across every surface they touched. Together, peanut butter and saltines created one of the simplest meals in the 1960s kitchen. The jar supplied richness and staying power. The cracker supplied crunch, and a surface that required no plate if the family was feeling optimistic about crumbs. A mother could set them on the table after school with a glass of milk, or place them beside a child who had rejected the official dinner but are still hungry enough to hover near the kitchen doorway. They also helped stretch soup when one had to serve more people than the label had confidently imagined. A stack of crackers made the bowl feel fuller. Peanut butter added a little substance to a lunch assembled from whatever remained before grocery day. This was convenience without a machine and economy without a speech. The meal did not announce that money was tight, time was short, or the cook was tired. It simply arrived on a plate. Neither staple disappeared. Peanut butter remains deeply familiar, and saltines still wait beside soup bowls and sickbeds. What changed was the world around them. Refrigerated snack packs, granola bars, packaged crackers with flavored fillings, microwave foods, school meal programs, and an enormous range of portable snacks gave families more choices. Awareness of peanut allergies also changed where and how peanut products could be served, especially in schools and shared spaces. Yet the older pairing still carries a distinct memory. A knife scraping the bottom of a jar, sleeve folded down to keep the remaining crackers crisp crumbs, pressed into a formica tabletop, and a lunch made without turning a single burner. Farther along the pantry shelf, convenience was preparing to become more colourful. A small box of gelatin and a larger box of cake mix promised that dessert could be bright, dependable, and ready for company, provided everyone was willing to wait for it to set or rise. A small box of gelatin could wait quietly for months, but once it came out of the pantry, the entire kitchen seemed to become more colourful. The powder might dissolve into cherry red, lemon yellow, orange, or a green bright enough to make the refrigerator shelf look temporarily illuminated. Hot water went into the bowl first, followed by careful stirring until the last crystals disappeared. Cold water came next, and then the waiting began. A child could inspect the refrigerator every 10 minutes without improving the process. The liquid needed time to become dessert salad or something that occupied the uncertain territory between the two. In many 1960s households flavored gelatin was valued because it kept well cost relatively little and could be prepared ahead of dinner or a gathering. It offered sweetness without requiring flour butter or an oven, although it did demand one quality that convenience advertising sometimes forgot to mention: patience. The simplest version was poured into small bowls and served plain, perhaps with canned fruit or a spoonful of whipped topping. It was cool, sweet, and easy for children to recognize, especially when a glass dish allowed the color to shine through. But gelatin could become far more ambitious. A ring mold might hold fruit cocktail, pineapple, shredded carrots, cottage cheese nuts, marshmallows, or other additions selected according to family tradition and the confidence of the recipe booklet. Sweet and savory versions appeared in cookbooks, magazines, company publications, church suppers, and luncheon menus throughout the middle of the century. Not every family made molded salads, and not every person at the table welcomed them. Still, the finished shape had undeniable presence. When the mold released cleanly onto a plate, the cook had produced something smooth, symmetrical, and visibly prepared in advance. When it refused to release, the kitchen entered a brief technical dispute involving warm water, a serving plate, and several increasingly firm taps. Gelatin fit the era's appetite for food that looked controlled. Fresh fruit could bruise, cake could fall, and pie crust could crack, but a properly set mold stood neatly within its boundaries. It could be prepared in the morning, hidden behind the milk, and revealed when guests arrived. That made it useful for family dinners, holiday tables, neighborhood gatherings, and church basement meals where appearance mattered almost as much as transportation. A glass bowl covered with wax paper or foil could travel reasonably well provided it stayed cold and no one placed it beside the car heater. The dish also helped a small quantity of fruit appear more generous. A few canned peaches or pears suspended in a bright mold became a complete dessert rather than a nearly empty can divided among several people. Convenience was doing some of the work, presentation was doing the rest, and the refrigerator was expected to hold everything together until serving time. One shelf away, the cake mix box offered a different kind of assurance. By the 1960s, packaged cake mixes were already familiar products rather than startling kitchen inventions. Betty Crocker, Duncan Hines, Pillsbury and other brands competed for attention with photographs of tall layers, smooth frosting, and slices that appeared to have been cut with architectural equipment. The home baker still added ingredients such as eggs, water, and sometimes oil, depending on the mix and instructions. She greased the pans, watched the oven, tested the center, cooled the layers, and dealt with the frosting. Yet the box removed several opportunities for trouble. Flour, sugar, leavening, flavoring, and other dry ingredients had already been measured and blended. There was less chance of forgetting the baking powder or discovering too late that the sugar canister contained 3 tablespoons and a great deal of optimism. Cake mix was especially useful when dessert carried a deadline. A child's birthday did not move simply because the afternoon became busy. Company might be expected after supper. A school event, bake sale, family reunion, or church gathering could require something that looked festive without consuming an entire day. The box transformed baking into a shorter, more predictable sequence. Pour, mix, beat, bake, cool, and decorate. The instructions sounded almost ceremonial in their certainty. The finished cake could be covered with chocolate frosting sprinkled with coconut topped with candles, or presented in a rectangular pan because no one had time to persuade 2 round layers to stand evenly. Families still had homemade recipes and many skilled bakers preferred them. Others used mixes only for hurried occasions. But the box offered a dependable alternative, allowing a cook to spend less time measuring and more time worrying about whether the cake would leave the pan. The convenience did not remove the emotional weight of the cake. Children rarely cared whether every dry ingredient had been measured separately. They remembered the candles, the frosting on the knife the bowl offered for licking, and the first slice placed on a paper plate. A boxed cake could still become the cake associated with a particular birthday Aunt Kitchen or family tradition. It might receive a homemade frosting, canned frosting fruit filling, or decorations applied with great affection and limited artistic control. The package provided a foundation, not the memory itself. That distinction mattered in the 1960s kitchen, where packaged foods were often combined with personal touches. A cook could use a cake mix and still consider the dessert her own, especially after she had changed the flavour, added an ingredient, adjusted the frosting, or rescued one corner that had remained attached to the pan. Gelatin and cake mix represented two versions of modern pantry confidence. One promised that hot water and refrigeration could produce a gleaming dessert. The other promised that a box, several fresh ingredients, and an oven could produce a respectable cake. Both reduced measuring. Both encouraged experimentation through package recipes and cookbooks. Both could wait until the household needed a birthday, a potluck contribution, a Sunday dessert, or a small improvement to an ordinary dinner. Neither eliminated work and neither guaranteed perfection. The gelatin might contain fruit that sank to the bottom. The cake might rise unevenly or carry a thin layer of crumbs beneath the frosting. But these products made celebration easier to begin. Behind them stood an older, less colourful pantry staple that offered no photograph of a finished dessert and no promise of instant success. The flour canister simply waited for the cook to supply the measurements, the method, and almost everything else. The flour canister did not need a bright photograph of a finished dessert. It usually sat on the counter or inside a lower cabinet plane, heavy and slightly dusty around the lid. In many 1960s kitchens, it was part of a matching set labelled flour, sugar, coffee and tea, although the lettering sometimes disappeared beneath fingerprints and years of washing. Lift the lid, and a faint cloud rose into the air. A metal measuring cup might be buried inside, its handle just visible above the white surface. Flour felt cool and soft between the fingers, but once it reached the counter, it behaved like a determined houseguest settling on the rolling pin, the apron, the cabinet handle, and at least one place no one remembered touching. Unlike a cake mix, all-purpose flour made no promise about what would happen next. It could become biscuits, pie crust, gravy, cookies, dumplings, fried chicken coating, or a pan of something that had not yet been named. The cook supplied the judgment. That judgment mattered because flour was less a single food than a starting point. A scoop added to shortening and milk could become biscuits for breakfast or supper. Stirred into hot fat, it began a roux or gravy that stretched pan drippings across a family table. Dusted over a board, it kept pie dough from sticking while a wooden rolling pin moved back and forth with a low, hollow sound. Mixed with sugar eggs and leavening, it formed cakes and cookies when the household wanted something sweeter than canned fruit. It coated pieces of chicken, fish liver, or vegetables before frying, creating the browned surface many families recognized before they even saw what was in the skillet. Recipes varied by region, income, ethnicity, and family tradition. Some kitchens used flour constantly for breads and gravies. Others relied more heavily on cornmeal rice, purchased bread, or packaged mixes. But where flour was used often, the canister marked the working centre of the kitchen, the place where measurements became meals. The flour canister also revealed how much older knowledge lived beside newer convenience. A woman might keep cake mix on one shelf, and still know by sight when biscuit dough needed another spoonful of flour. She might follow a printed recipe carefully for a birthday cake, then make gravy without measuring anything at all. Many household cooks had learned by watching mothers, grandmothers, aunts, neighbours, home economics teachers, or the women standing beside them at church suppers. Instructions such as add enough flour assumed an experience that could not be printed neatly on a recipe card. Enough for what texture, enough for which weather, enough for the brand of shortening the size of the eggs, or the amount of milk left in the bottle. The answer lived in the hand. Dough that was too wet clung to the fingers. Dough that was too dry cracked at the edges. Flour demanded attention, and it rewarded familiarity. A box could simplify baking, but the canister still carried the household's accumulated memory. Keeping flour on hand required its own quiet routine. The grocery bag was heavier when a new sack came home, and transferring it into the canister had to be done carefully unless the kitchen floor needed a fresh white coating. The lid mattered. Flour had to remain dry and protected from insects, dampness, kitchen odours, and the small accidents of ordinary life. Some families stored it in its original paper bag inside a cabinet. Others poured it into metal, ceramic, glass, or plastic containers. In warm or humid climates, storage habits could differ, and households with limited pantry space might buy smaller quantities more often. A large family that baked regularly could empty a sack with surprising speed. Someone had to notice the level dropping before the final cup disappeared halfway through a recipe. Discovering an empty flour canister after the shortening had already been cut into a bowl was not a dramatic national crisis, but inside one kitchen it could feel extremely well timed. Flour also helped turn inexpensive or leftover ingredients into food that felt complete. Pan drippings became gravy. Fruit nearing the end of its useful life went under a crust or into a cobbler. A small amount of meat could be surrounded by dumplings, noodles, biscuits, or thickened sauce. Soup became more substantial. Milk, eggs, and a little sugar became pancakes or a simple pudding. None of this meant that flour erased scarcity or made every budget easy. It meant that skill could change texture, volume, and presentation. A cook who understood flour could make a table look fuller without pretending that ingredients were unlimited. That ability was often treated as ordinary household competence rather than specialized knowledge, even though the difference between tender biscuits and hard little discs depended on handling temperature, proportion, and timing. The meal might appear simple. The judgment behind it was not. By the late 1960s and into the decades that followed, packaged breads, refrigerated doughs, frozen foods, restaurant meals, and increasingly specialized baking products changed how often some households reached for the flour canister. Yet all-purpose flour never vanished. It remained one of the pantry's most flexible basics, even as its role shifted from daily necessity to occasional baking ingredient in many homes. The memory survives in physical details, the scrape of a measuring cup against the side of the container, the ring left on the counter when the canister was moved, the damp cloth used to collect flour without spreading it farther, and the fingerprint pressed into a pie crust before the edge was crimped properly. Flour was quiet, inexpensive, and almost invisible once the meal was finished. But behind biscuits, gravy cookies, fried coatings, and family pies, it had been doing the work all along. Beside it, two smaller containers waited with equal importance. One held sweetness, the other held seasoning. Running out of either could change the entire table. The sugar canister usually looked more cheerful than the flour canister, even though it could cause more trouble when the lid came off. Granulated sugar poured in a clean white stream sparkled briefly under the kitchen light, and then scattered across the counter in tiny crystals that found every crack in the formica. In many 1960s, homes' sugar lived in more than one place. A large supply waited in the pantry or canister set, while a smaller bowl sat on the breakfast table beside the coffee pot. A spoon disappeared into it several times each morning. Adults sweetened coffee or tea. children sprinkled sugar over oatmeal cereal, sliced grapefruit, or berries that were not yet willing to taste sweet on their own. The ingredient seemed simple, but the household used it in so many directions that an empty container could interrupt breakfast, baking, beverages, desserts, and the pitcher of powdered drink mix expected after school. Sugar was one of the pantry's great transformers. It softened the sharpness of canned tomatoes in certain family sauces, balanced vinegar in dressings and pickles browned across the tops of baked goods, and turned flour, eggs, and fat into cakes or cookies. Mixed with cinnamon, it covered buttered toast. Stirred into lemon juice and water, it became a summer drink. Added to canned fruit gelatin, whipped toppings, or pudding, it made dessert appear even when fresh ingredients were limited. Some households used it for preserving fruit or making jams, especially where gardens, local produce, or family canning traditions remained important. Others bought nearly all of their preserves at the supermarket and knew sugar mainly through coffee cups, cereal bowls, and baking. The size of the bag, the speed at which it disappeared, and the recipes attached to it varied greatly. What remained constant was its usefulness. Sugar could make an inexpensive ingredient feel like a treat, and it could make children suddenly interested in a food they had ignored only seconds earlier. The person managing the pantry had to understand that sugar did not disappear only in large amounts. It vanished one spoonful at a time. A cup went into a cake. Several spoonfuls went into coffee throughout the morning. More entered a pitcher of iced tea or fruit drink. A child added a modest amount to cereal, then added another modest amount when no one was looking. By the end of the week, the canister that had seemed comfortably full could reveal its metal bottom with almost no warning. This made sugar part of the quiet arithmetic of grocery planning. A mother who baked frequently needed a larger reserve than one who relied on packaged desserts. A household serving sweet tea, homemade cookies, or preserves could use it quickly. Other families rationed it carefully because the budget mattered more than the recipes. Sugar was common, but it was never truly free, and an experienced shopper knew that a pantry staple became expensive mainly by being used everywhere. Salt occupied a smaller container and an even larger role. The familiar cardboard cylinder or shaker might stand beside the stove on the table, or inside the same cabinet as pepper spices and baking supplies. It entered soups, vegetables, potatoes, eggs, meat dishes, bread, doughs, gravies and casseroles. A pinch could sharpen flavor without announcing itself. Too little made dinner seem flat. Too much turned the entire table silent for a different reason. Many cooks measured salt with a spoon when baking, but relied on fingers, habit, and taste when preparing supper. The movement was quick lid, lifted hand-tilted grains scattered over the skillet. The cook might taste pause and add a little more. Children, meanwhile, sometimes reach for the table shaker before taking a bite, a habit that could earn a look from the person who had already seasoned the food and considered the matter settled. Salt carried practical uses beyond the final taste of dinner. It helped season boiling water, shape the flavor of homemade breads, and played a part in some preserving and pickling traditions. In households that still canned garden vegetables or made relishes, correct recipes and careful methods mattered, though practices differed and were not always as safe or standardized as modern guidance requires. Salt also appeared in small household routines that were passed along through family experience, but the kitchen table remained its central stage. There it became part of etiquette as well as flavor. The shaker was passed rather than reached across several plates. Children were sometimes told to taste their food before adding more. A guest who salted immediately might unintentionally suggest that the cook's judgment required assistance. It was a tiny object carrying a surprising amount of social meaning. Sugar and salt stood together because they were opposites in taste but partners in routine. One promised sweetness, celebration, and comfort. The other provided balanced depth and the familiar flavor of everyday cooking. Both were inexpensive by the spoonful, essential in countless recipes and easy to take for granted until the container was empty. They also showed how much control rested with the person preparing the meal. A little more sugar could persuade a child to eat oatmeal. A little less could stretch the supply until grocery day. Salt could rescue bland potatoes or ruin a pot of soup. Neither ingredient required an appliance, a brand name recipe, or a modern package promise. They required judgment, and judgment was often built from repetition, tasting, adjusting, remembering what the family preferred, and noticing which dish returned with scraped clean plates. These two staples never disappeared from American kitchens, but their place in family life changed as sweetened cereals, bottled drinks, frozen desserts, snack foods, seasoning blends, and prepared meals moved more of the measuring work into factories. Sugar and salt increasingly arrived already hidden inside products, even when the household canisters were used less often. Yet the older memory remains visible in a coffee spoon tapping the side of a cup, a sugar bowl passed across the breakfast table, a salt shaker leaving a pale ring near the stove, and a mother checking both containers before beginning a recipe. Behind them waited two smaller boxes and a white can of shortening. They were less noticeable than sugar and salt, but without them biscuits would not rise, cakes would lose their lift, and pie crust would have to find another way to become tender. The baking powder tin was small enough to disappear behind the flour canister, yet a missing spoonful could determine whether a pan of biscuits rose proudly or settled into something better suited for holding a door open. In many 1960s, kitchens' baking powder came in a round metal can with a tight lid, while baking soda waited nearby in a familiar cardboard box. The containers were modest compared with the colourful cake mixes and canned foods around them. They showed no frosted layer cake ready for company, and made no promise of an entire dinner. Their work happened quietly inside dough and batter, where a small measured amount created bubbles, lift, and tenderness. A cook might level the spoon carefully against the rim of the tin, knowing that generosity was not always a virtue in baking. Too little produced heavy results. Too much could leave an unpleasant taste. These were pantry staples that rewarded accuracy, even in kitchens where many other ingredients were measured by sight and experience. Baking powder was the dependable leavener for biscuits, pancakes, muffins, quick breads, and cakes that did not depend on yeast. When liquid met the dry ingredients and the batter reached the oven, chemical reactions helped it expand. The science might have been explained in a home economics classroom or printed in a cookbook, but at the kitchen counter it appeared as a familiar sequence: sift or stir the flour, add the baking powder and salt, cut in the shortening, pour in the milk, and handle the dough as little as possible. The cook did not need to recite the chemistry. She needed to know that the oven should already be hot, and that biscuit dough did not improve under prolonged negotiation. In households where biscuits appeared regularly, beside gravy-fried chicken beans or Sunday supper, the baking powder tin could empty more quickly than its size suggested. Someone had to shake it, listen for what remained, and add it to the grocery list before the next batch began. Baking soda had a different personality. It could help cakes, cookies, and quick breads rise when a recipe included acidic ingredients such as buttermilk, molasses, or certain fruits. It might appear in gingerbread chocolate cake biscuits or family recipes written on cards that simply assumed the cook understood why the soda was there. The box was often kept long after its sharp paper edges softened, because it also became associated with household tasks beyond baking. Families used it in various cleaning and deodorizing routines, although the methods differed and not every old recommendation was effective or suitable for every surface. Inside the mixing bowl, its role demanded restraint. A fraction of a teaspoon could be useful. An enthusiastic scoop could make the finished food taste distinctly as though the pantry itself had entered the recipe. The box looked ordinary, but it reminded the cook that baking was less forgiving than soup. A pot of soup could be adjusted. A cake revealed the decision only after the oven door opened. Beside these small containers stood the large white can of vegetable shortening. The lid came off with a firm pull, revealing a smooth, pale fat that held its shape at room temperature. A spoon or measuring cup pressed into it, and emerged with a rounded mound, leaving behind a curved hollow that remained until the next recipe. Crisco was the most recognizable national example for many families, though households also used other brands, lard butter, margarine, or combinations depending on price, tradition, availability, and the dish being prepared. Shortening could be cut into flour for biscuits rubbed into a pie crust, creamed with sugar for cookies used to grease a cake pan, or melted in a skillet. Its neutral flavor and shelf stability made it practical, especially when butter was expensive, needed for the table, or simply was not the fat a family recipe required. Pie crust showed what shortening could do when handled well. Flour, salt, cold water, and small pieces of fat were combined just enough to form a dough. The goal was tenderness, not enthusiasm. Too much mixing encouraged toughness. Too much water created sticking. Too little caused the dough to crack while it was rolled. The shortening helped form small pockets within the crust, producing layers and a crumbly texture after baking. A skilled cook moved quickly, dusting the board with flour, lifting the dough around the rolling pin, and lowering it into the pie plate without tearing the center. A less cooperative crust might be patched with scraps and hidden beneath a decorative edge. Once filled with apples, peaches, pumpkin, or custard, the evidence was usually forgiven. The family remembered the warm slice and the smell from the oven, not the emergency repair concealed beneath it. Shortening also belonged to the skillet. It could melt into a clear pool for frying chicken, potatoes, fish dough, or other foods depending on the household and region. The kitchen filled with heat and the steady sound of bubbling fat. Flour-coated pieces browned at the edges while the cook turned them carefully, often using a heavy skillet, and the judgment gained from watching color rather than a timer. Frying demanded attention. The fat had to be hot enough to brown the coating without soaking it, but not so hot that the outside darkened before the center was done. Afterward came the less glamorous part, cooling, straining, saving, or discarding the used fat according to household practice, then wiping the stove and dealing with the fine film that frying seemed capable of placing far beyond the skillet. Convenience had not yet learned how to clean the range. The baking boxes and shortening can worked together because they gave plain flour structure, lift, and tenderness. They helped transform inexpensive ingredients into biscuits, crusts, pancakes, cookies, and quick breads that made a meal feel complete. Their importance was easy to overlook because they rarely appeared as the main food on the table. No child asked for a birthday spoonful of baking powder, and no guest praised the shortening can. Yet remove them from the pantry and several familiar dishes became difficult or impossible to reproduce in the same way. Later decades brought refrigerated dough, frozen pie shells, aerosol baking sprays, new oils, and a wider range of packaged mixes, reducing how often some cooks reached for these containers. But in the working 1960s kitchen, they remained close to the flour, ready for the next recipe card to be unfolded. Farther down the shelf waited a grain with an even stronger regional identity, one that could become yellow cornbread, a crisp frying coating, or a supper whose sweetness depended entirely on where the family lived. The cornmeal sack did not look especially important until supper needed something warm, filling, and inexpensive beside a pot of beans. In many 1960s, kitchens cornmeal waited near the flour in a paper bag, cardboard box, or tightly covered container, its texture slightly gritty, and its color ranging from pale white to deep yellow. Open it, and the meal shifted softly beneath the scoop, leaving a faint dust on the counter and a few stubborn grains under the canister. Unlike cake mix, cornmeal carried no single national promise. What it became depended heavily on where the family lived who had taught the cook and what the household believed cornbread was supposed to taste like. In one kitchen, it went into a cast-iron skillet with little or no sugar. In another, the batter was sweeter, softer, and baked in a square pan. Both families could be completely certain that the other version had misunderstood the assignment. Cornbread was the most recognizable use, but even that simple name covered many different foods. Some cooks heated fat in a heavy skillet before pouring in the batter, creating dark, crisp edges and a bottom that released with a satisfying scrape. Others used a baking pan and produced a lighter, more cake-like square. Buttermilk might provide tang, while regular milk appeared where that was what the refrigerator held. Eggs, flour, sugar, shortening, bacon, drippings, or none of them might enter the bowl depending on the recipe and region. In parts of the South, especially in families shaped by older rural traditions, cornbread was often treated as everyday bread rather than dessert. It appeared beside beans, greens, stews, fried foods and plates where gravy or cooking liquid needed to be gathered before the meal was finished. Elsewhere, sweeter versions became familiar through home recipes, packaged mixes, school cafeterias and changing tastes. Cornmeal did not create one American cornbread. It created a long-running family argument with excellent leftovers. Those leftovers rarely went to waste. A wedge of cold cornbread could be split, warmed, buttered, crumbled into a bowl, or eaten beside another meal the next day. Some people remember cornbread broken into milk or buttermilk, an economical supper or snack rooted in particular regional and family customs. Others knew it as the reliable companion to a pot of pinto beans, navy beans, black-eyed peas, or whatever variety had simmered through the afternoon. The beans supplied substance, the cornbread supplied warmth and texture, and together they could feed several people without requiring an expensive cut of meat. A ham hock bacon, salt pork, onion, or seasoning might flavour the pot when available. In leaner kitchens, the meal could be simpler. It was inexpensive, but it was not meaningless. The smell of cornmeal baking in a hot skillet, the crackle around the edge, and the first piece lifted with a spatula became attached to particular tables, relatives, and evenings when the family ate what the pantry could provide. Cornmeal also moved from the oven to the frying pan. It formed a rough coating around fish, okra, green tomatoes, squash, and other foods, helping the outside become crisp while the inside remained soft. The cook might pour the meal into a shallow dish, season it, and press each piece into the grains before lowering it into hot fat. The coating did not become smooth like flour. It stayed textured, producing small browned points that caught the salt and broke beneath the teeth. In fishing communities, rural households, and regional kitchens with strong frying traditions, cornmeal could be as important beside the skillet as flour. Yet its uses differed widely across racial, ethnic, and geographic lines. African American cooks, native communities, southern white households, Appalachian families, southwestern kitchens, and immigrant households all had distinct corn-based traditions shaped by local ingredients and histories. A responsible memory of the 1960s pantry has to leave room for those differences rather than turning one skillet of cornbread into the recipe of an entire country. Small cakes made from cornmeal batter offered another way to stretch the staple. Depending on the family, they might be called corn cakes, griddle cakes, johnny cakes, hoe cakes, or another local name, and the recipes were not interchangeable simply because the finished food was round. Some were thin and crisp, others were thick enough to split and butter. they could appear at breakfast beside a savoury meal, or when bread was needed quickly, and there was no time to wait for yeast. A spoonful of batter hit the hot surface with a soft hiss spread slightly, and formed tiny bubbles before being turned. The ingredients were plain, but timing mattered. Turn too early and the cake could break. Wait too long, and the edge became darker than intended. Like biscuits, corn cakes looked easy because experienced hands made them quickly. The speed came from repetition, not from the food requiring no skill. The choice between white and yellow cornmeal could also carry regional meaning. Families often bought what local stores carried, what relatives had always used, or what produced the colour and flavour they expected. Some preferred a coarser meal with a more noticeable texture. Others used a finer product that blended more smoothly into batter. Self-rising cornmeal mixes simplified preparation by combining cornmeal with leavening and other ingredients, while plain cornmeal allowed cooks to control the recipe themselves. Supermarket shelves increasingly offered packaged convenience, but many households still measured from memory. A cook might add liquid until the batter looked right, a phrase that was perfectly clear to the person holding the spoon, and almost useless to anyone learning from across the room. Recipe cards sometimes recorded exact cups and teaspoons. Family practice often included several invisible corrections. Cornmeal remained valuable because it was versatile filling and capable of making a modest meal feel settled. A bowl of beans without cornbread might still be dinner, but the warm wedge beside it gave the plate a sense of completion. A few vegetables became more substantial under a crisp coating. Breakfast could be made from a small amount of batter and a hot griddle. The staple survived well beyond the 1960s, though its role became less central in many households as packaged bread. Refrigerated biscuits, frozen side dishes, and restaurant meals became easier to obtain. It never truly vanished. Instead, it became more strongly associated with regional cooking, family tradition, and recipes prepared because someone remembered exactly how they were supposed to taste. After the skillet cooled and the last yellow crumbs were brushed from the table, another grain waited in a tall canister. Rolled oats belonged to a different hour of the day, appearing first in a steaming breakfast bowl and returning later inside a cookie beside a glass of milk. The rolled oats canister belonged to the coldest part of the morning. Before the school bus, before the lunch boxes were lined up, and before anyone had fully decided to be pleasant, a saucepan of water or milk began to warm on the stove. Rolled oats waited in a tall cardboard container, or a tightly covered pantry jar, pale flakes packed together with a faint grainy smell. A measuring cup scraped through them, and the dry oats fell into the pan in a light uneven stream. Within minutes they thickened into a breakfast that could hold heat far longer than an impatient child considered reasonable. The spoon left a trail through the bowl. Steam rose toward the kitchen window. Butter softened across the surface while brown sugar, white sugar, cinnamon, raisins, milk or syrup were added according to family habit. Plain oatmeal was economical and filling. It was also very good at reminding children that school mornings were not designed entirely for their entertainment. The practical value of oats was difficult to argue with. They kept well-required little pantry space and could provide breakfast for several people without using eggs, bacon, or a large amount of milk. In households watching the grocery budget that mattered, a pot of oatmeal stretched easily when another child appeared at the table or when the bread box was nearly empty. The cook could make it thinner or thicker, sweeter or plainer, depending on what was available and what the family expected. Some children liked a firm mound that held the spoon upright. Others wanted enough milk to turn the bowl into something close to soup. One child accepted raisins, another treated them as an administrative error. The parent serving breakfast learned these preferences quickly because a school morning allowed little time for debate. Oatmeal did not need to be elegant. It needed to be warm ready, and finished before someone missed the bus. The breakfast carried different meanings from one household to another. In colder regions, hot cereal could feel like a sensible answer to dark winter mornings. In warmer climates, it might appear less often or mainly during certain seasons. Some families cooked oats slowly on the stove, while others chose faster cooking varieties when time was tight. Milk might be used during cooking or poured over the finished bowl. Children who dislike the soft texture sometimes required a generous layer of sugar before cooperation became possible. Adults might prefer oats with only salt butter or a little cream. No single version represented every American kitchen, but the routine was recognizable. The refrigerator motor humming spoons touching ceramic bowls, toast rising nearby, and a parent reminding everyone that oatmeal became more difficult to eat after it turned cold. This warning was accurate. A forgotten bowl could develop a surface strong enough to suggest that breakfast had begun setting its own table rules. Rolled oats returned later in the day with a completely different reputation. Mixed into cookie dough, the same flakes children had examined suspiciously at breakfast became part of an after-school reward. Shortening or butter was creamed with sugar eggs were added, and flour leavening spices and oats followed. Raisins might enter the bowl along with nuts, chocolate pieces, coconut, or whatever variation the family recipe allowed. The dough was rougher and heavier than plain sugar cookie dough with visible flakes that caught on the spoon. Small portions dropped onto a baking sheet spread into cookies with browned edges and soft centers. The kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon, caramelized sugar, and warm grain. A child arriving home could detect that smell before reaching the kitchen doorway. Suddenly, oats required no persuasion at all. Their image had improved considerably during the school day. Oatmeal cookies also showed how pantry staples work together. Flour provided structure, sugar supplied sweetness shortening or butter added richness. Baking soda or powder created lift, and oats gave texture and substance. Raisins from a pantry box could make the cookies seem almost responsible, though children were not always convinced that responsibility belonged inside dessert. The cookies travelled well, in lunchboxes stayed recognizable after several days in a covered tin, and could be made in large batches for family gatherings, school events, church functions, or an ordinary week when the household needed something ready to hand out. They were homemade, but they were practical homemade food. The recipe did not require delicate decoration or expensive ingredients. A spoonful of dough could vary in size, the rows did not need to be perfectly straight, and a broken cookie still tasted exactly like the others. That made them suitable for busy kitchens where appearance mattered less than having enough. The oat container itself often received a second life after it was empty. A sturdy cardboard cylinder could hold crayons, buttons, sewing supplies, small toys, kitchen utensils, or other objects that needed somewhere to go. The reuse was not unique to oats. Coffee tins, jars, margarine tubs, and boxes also migrated through the household. But the tall oat canister was especially useful because it had a lid stood upright and looked capable of organizing almost anything. One week it held breakfast. The next, it might sit in a child's room full of building pieces or on a workbench containing nails. This habit reflected a household culture in which packaging was often evaluated twice, first for what it contained and then for what it might store after the food was gone. Throwing away a useful container could feel unnecessarily final. Rolled oats never disappeared from the American pantry, but their daily role changed. Boxed cereals, breakfast pastries, frozen waffles, instant packets, drive-through breakfasts, and increasingly hurried mornings gave families more options. Many households continued making oatmeal while others saved oats mainly for baking or occasional cold weather breakfasts. Yet the memory remains attached to two opposite moments: the steaming bowl that had to be eaten before school and the warm cookie waiting afterward. The same pantry staple could feel like an obligation at 7 in the morning and a reward at 4 in the afternoon. That was part of its quiet usefulness. It adapted to the hour, the budget, and the mood of the kitchen. Beyond the oat canister waited two staples that performed an even larger feat of household arithmetic. Rice and dried beans could sit almost unnoticed for weeks, then combine with thyme, seasoning, and a deep pot to feed more people than the grocery budget seemed prepared to support. The rice bag and the bean sack rarely drew attention when the pantry door opened. They stood quietly behind brighter boxes and labelled cans, plain foods that asked for time rather than admiration. In many 1960s kitchens, rice came in a paper bag or cardboard package, while dried beans waited in another bag, glass jar, or covered container. A scoop of rice made a soft rushing sound as it entered the pot. Beans struck the bottom with a harder rattle, each one small, dry, and unimpressive until water and heat began their work. Together, these staples represented a kind of household arithmetic, understood by anyone responsible for feeding several people with limited money. A cup became a pot. A modest amount of meat became seasoning rather than the center of the plate. Leftovers became tomorrow's lunch. The ingredients were inexpensive, but the knowledge required to turn them into a good meal came from family custom, regional tradition, and close attention to the stove. Rice changed character depending on the household preparing it. In some kitchens it appeared as a plain side dish beneath chicken gravy or vegetables. In others it belonged inside casserole soups, stuffed peppers, tomato dishes, or rice pudding. Families shaped by Southern, Mexican, American, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Asian American, Native, Creole, Cajun, and many other food traditions used rice in ways that could not be reduced to one national recipe. Some cooks rinsed it carefully, others poured it directly into the pot. Some measured water precisely, while others judged the depth with a finger, or relied on a method learned long before a recipe card was involved. The lid went on steam gathered underneath, and the cook resisted lifting it too often. Rice required restraint. Stirring could make it sticky when separate grains were expected, and too much water could turn the bottom of the pot into paste. A successful batch looked simple only because someone already knew when to leave it alone. That simplicity made rice useful when dinner had to stretch. A few pieces of chicken resting over a bed of rice could feed more people than the chicken alone. A spoonful of gravy spread farther when the plate contained a generous mound beneath it. Canned tomatoes, broth onions, seasonings, or leftover vegetables could turn plain rice into a main dish, without requiring an expensive cut of meat. In some households, quick cooking rice offered greater speed, while others preferred conventional varieties because of texture, habit, price, or family expectation. The choice reflected more than convenience. It reflected how much time the cook had, what the local store stocked, and what everyone at the table believed rice should be. Children who complained about a plain bowl might accept the same grain, after it absorbed tomato sauce, meat drippings, or butter. Rice did not demand to be the star of dinner. Its talent was making everything around it seem more plentiful. Dried beans required more patience. The bag might contain navy beans, pinto beans, lima beans, black-eyed peas, kidney beans, or another variety tied to the family's region and cooking traditions. Before cooking, someone spread them across a plate or counter to look for small stones, damaged beans, or bits that did not belong. They were rinsed, soaked in many households, and placed in a deep pot with fresh water. Then came the slow simmer. An onion, garlic, salt pork, bacon, ham, hock ham bone, or other seasoning might enter the pot depending on what the pantry, refrigerator, garden budget, and family recipe allowed. The beans gradually softened while the cooking liquid thickened and filled the kitchen with a deep earthy smell. This was not convenience measured in minutes. It was economy measured in portions. The pot took time, but much of that time asked only that someone remain nearby enough to add water, adjust the heat, and prevent the bottom from scorching. The meat in a bean pot often served a different purpose from the meat in a roast or chop. A small piece could flavour the entire pot, lending smoke, salt, and richness, without providing a separate portion for every person. A ham bone left from an earlier dinner could return for another meal, releasing what remained into the broth. This was not simply thrift for its own sake. It was a practical way to use everything valuable in the kitchen. Beans could be served with cornbread, rice, greens, sliced onions, relishes, or whatever accompaniments belonged to the household. They could appear thick and seasoned one day, then return as soup or a reheated side the next. In many families, the flavour improved after resting overnight, which was fortunate because the pot had usually produced more than one supper. The refrigerator received the leftovers, and dinner had already begun preparing itself for tomorrow. Rice and beans also carried complicated social meanings. They could be comfort foods, cultural touchstones, everyday staples, or reminders of periods when money was short. One child might remember them warmly because a grandparent made them every week. Another might remember wishing for the packaged foods advertised on television. It would be wrong to treat these meals as proof that every family lived simply or happily, just as it would be wrong to dismiss them as food people ate only because they had no choice. The same pot could hold necessity, skill, identity, and affection at once. Cooks adjusted seasonings, protected family methods, and knew which relatives expected more broth, softer beans, firmer rice, or a crust from the bottom of the pot. These preferences transformed basic ingredients into foods that belonged to a particular table. Neither rice nor dried beans disappeared from American pantries. Their importance continued, especially in households where they remained central to regional and cultural cooking. What changed in some homes was the amount of time available for soaking, simmering, watching, and reheating. Canned beans, instant rice, frozen side dishes, restaurant meals, and packaged combinations offered faster alternatives. Smaller households sometimes had less reason to prepare a large pot, while busier schedules made long cooking feel difficult to fit into the day. Yet the older pantry memory endures a bag folded shut, with a clothespin beans soaking in a bowl before breakfast, steam escaping from beneath a heavy lid, and a wooden spoon dragged across the bottom to make sure nothing had caught. Rice and beans were plain only while they remained dry. Once the pot began to simmer, they became proof that careful cooking could make limited ingredients feel abundant. Nearby, 2 boxes of noodles waited to perform the same trick more quickly, one shaped like small elbows and the other cut into wide ribbons for soup, gravy, and casserole. The macaroni box made a dry, hollow rattle when it was lifted from the pantry, the small elbows shifting inside as though they were already impatient for the boiling water. In many 1960s kitchens, plain macaroni was one of the safest ingredients a mother could keep on hand because it asked for very little and agreed to almost anything. It could be covered with cheese, folded into a cold salad, mixed with canned tomatoes, stretched with ground beef, or buried beneath condensed soup and cracker crumbs. A pot of salted water, a wooden spoon, and 10 or 12 minutes could turn a shelf-stable box into the foundation of dinner. The elbows softened, swelled, and multiplied enough to make the saucepan look more generous than the package had suggested. That mattered when the meat was scarce, the grocery trip was still several days away, or an extra child had followed someone home from school and was now sitting at the kitchen table as though supper had always included him. Macaroni and cheese existed in many forms, from carefully prepared sauces to packaged versions that reduced the process to boiling, draining, and stirring. A homemade pan might begin with flour and shortening or butter, followed by milk and whatever cheese the household could afford. The sauce coated the curved noodles and settled into every opening before the dish went into the oven. Breadcrumbs, cracker crumbs, sliced tomatoes, or extra cheese might cover the top. Other families served it directly from the saucepan because there was no practical reason to create another dish to wash. Children generally recognized macaroni and cheese as friendly food, although they could still object if the sauce was too sharp, the top too brown, or an adult had introduced onions without authorization. The dish was inexpensive compared with a meat-centered supper, but it did not necessarily feel like a substitute. A steaming bowl, a spoon, and a glass of milk could make it a complete meal in its own right. Cold macaroni salad gave the same box a second identity. After boiling, the noodles were rinsed or cooled, then mixed with mayonnaise or another dressing, and whatever additions belonged to the family recipe. Chopped celery supplied crunch, pickles or relish added sharpness. Hard-cooked eggs, onion, canned tuna peas, pimentos, or small pieces of cheese might enter the bowl. The mixture waited in the refrigerator until supper, a picnic, a reunion, or a church gathering. It travelled in a covered glass bowl, and often arrived beside potato salad, baked beans, sliced ham, and dishes protected by carefully tightened foil. Macaroni salad looked modest, but making a large bowl involved several small jobs, cooking without turning the noodles soft, chopping the additions, judging the dressing, and keeping everything cold. The result had to remain moist without becoming loose and heavily dressed. Every family seemed to have a preferred balance, and every gathering supplied at least one person prepared to explain why another household had used too much mayonnaise. Macaroni also joined ground beef in the skillet or deep pot, creating the sort of supper that could absorb whatever the pantry offered. The meat was browned with onion when there was an onion, then combined with canned tomatoes, tomato sauce seasonings, and cooked noodles. Some families called the result goulash, although it had little resemblance to traditional Hungarian versions. Others knew it as American chop suey beef and macaroni, or simply the meal made when there was 1 pound of hamburger and several people expecting dinner. The pasta spread the meat throughout the dish so that every bowl received some, even when no serving contained very much. Leftovers reheated well, and could return the next evening with grated cheese, additional tomato sauce, or a side of bread. This was pantry cooking at its most practical. The recipe tolerated substitutions, used one main pot, and did not collapse because the cook had slightly more macaroni than beef. In fact, that was often the point. Egg noodles waited in a different box or bag, usually wider, flatter, and more delicate than macaroni. When poured into boiling water, they bent quickly and moved through the pot in pale ribbons. Their soft texture made them natural companions for chicken soup beef and gravy, stroganoff-style dishes and casseroles. A spoonful beneath pot roast or stewed meat caught the juices that might otherwise spread across the plate. In homes with Central or Eastern European family traditions, noodles could appear in dishes shaped by older recipes, while other households knew them mainly through chicken soup and tuna casserole. Some cooks made noodles from flour and eggs, rolling the dough thin across a floured table and cutting it by hand. Others depended on the packaged version because it was faster, consistent, and always available. Both approaches could belong to the same family, with homemade noodles reserved for Sundays or holidays and the pantry box opened on an ordinary Tuesday. Chicken noodle soup showed why egg noodles were worth keeping. A homemade pot might begin with chicken pieces or bones, water, onion, celery, carrots, and thyme. The noodles entered near the end, swelling in the broth, and making a limited amount of chicken feel like a fuller meal. When illness entered the house, the soup carried emotional importance beyond its ingredients. A bowl placed beside a bed or on the kitchen table suggested care, warmth, and the expectation that the person eating it would soon improve. Packaged noodles helped shorten the work without removing that meaning. They also turned leftover chicken into another dinner, especially when the original roast had already served its first purpose. The noodles absorbed flavour, the vegetables filled the bowl, and the pieces of meat no longer needed to be large enough for individual portions. One chicken could continue feeding the household long after the best slices were gone. Tuna noodle casserole brought egg noodles into the world of condensed soup, canned fish, and oven-baked convenience. Cooked noodles were folded with tuna, a cream-based soup, milk, peas, or other vegetables then placed in a glass baking dish. Crushed crackers, bread crumbs, potato chips, or another crisp topping might be scattered over the surface before baking. The casserole emerged bubbling at the edges, pale and creamy underneath, crisp across the top, and hot enough to require more patience than its soft appearance suggested. It could feed a family from inexpensive pantry ingredients and required no fresh cut of meat. Some people remember it fondly. Others remember moving peas carefully to one side of the plate. Both reactions became part of the dish's history. It was not luxurious, but it was dependable, and dependability had considerable value on a busy weeknight. Plain macaroni and egg noodles never vanished, though their pantry competition grew. Frozen dinners, boxed meal kits, refrigerated pasta takeout, and microwavable dishes offered new forms of speed. Yet the two boxes remained useful because they could become something different every time the cupboard opened. Macaroni could be cheesy, tomato-covered, chilled, or baked. Egg noodles could carry broth, gravy, chicken, tuna, or the final spoonfuls of a stew. They stretched meat-accepted leftovers and made a saucepan look reassuringly full. Their memory lives in the scrape of a wooden spoon against the pot steam fogging the kitchen window, a casserole bubbling behind the oven door, and one noodle tested for doneness before the rest were drained. On the next shelf stood a can that brought colour, acidity, and the beginning of several familiar suppers. Once the opener cut through its lid, tomatoes could lead the kitchen toward chili spaghetti sauce vegetable soup, or another pot of American goulash. The tomato can announced itself before dinner had a name. The manual opener bit into the metal lid with a hard click, then turned around the rim while the can shifted beneath one steady hand. When the lid lifted, the kitchen released the sharp, slightly sweet smell of tomatoes packed in juice. In many 1960s, pantries canned tomatoes waited in several useful forms: whole tomatoes crushed or chopped tomatoes in some markets tomato sauce, and the smaller, more concentrated can of tomato paste. The labels differed, and so did the family recipes, but the purpose was reassuringly similar. Tomatoes could give colour, acidity, moisture, and body to a meal built from ground beef, beans, noodles, rice, or leftover vegetables. They were especially valuable outside the local growing season, when fresh supermarket tomatoes could be expensive, limited, or less flavourful. A can did not ask whether the garden had produced well. It simply waited until someone needed supper to become red. Chili was one of the most familiar directions the can could take, although the word described many different dishes across the country. In one home ground, beef browned with onion before canned tomatoes, beans and seasoning entered the pot. In another, beans were absent and the meat carried the dish. Some families preferred a thick mixture served in bowls, while others made something looser that could be spooned over rice crackers, cornbread, or even spaghetti according to local custom. The heat level varied just as widely. One household used enough chili powder to warm the mouth. Another produced a gentle tomato and beef stew that children could eat without keeping a glass of milk nearby. There was no single 1960s American chili, despite what any confident neighbour might have claimed. The pantry can allowed each family to build its own version shaped by region, income, heritage, and the ingredients still available near the end of the week. Chili also rewarded the cook for thinking ahead. A large pot could feed several people, remain warm for a late arriving family member, and often taste fuller after a night in the refrigerator. Ground beef stretched farther when surrounded by beans, tomatoes, and liquid. Crackers crumbled over the top added texture, while shredded cheese or chopped onion could make the bowl seem more generous when the refrigerator allowed it. The dish tolerated substitutions better than many formal recipes. An extra can of tomatoes could enlarge the pot. Leftover beans could disappear into it. A little tomato paste could deepen the colour when the mixture looked thin. This flexibility mattered in kitchens where dinner plans changed according to work shifts, school activities, unexpected guests, and the condition of the grocery budget. Chili did not require every ingredient to arrive in perfect proportion. It merely required enough time to simmer until the contents agreed to belong together. American goulash offered the tomato can another assignment. The name covered a home-style combination of ground beef, macaroni, onion, and tomatoes that was far removed from traditional Hungarian goulash. In some regions, it was called American chop suey, while other families used names that never appeared in a cookbook at all. The preparation was practical. Brown the meat, drain or manage the fat. According to household habit, add onion when available, pour in tomatoes or sauce season, and combine with cooked macaroni. 1 pound of hamburger no longer had to become 4 separate patties. It could spread through an entire pot, touching every spoonful without dominating any of them. The macaroni absorbed the tomato flavour, and the tomatoes kept the mixture from becoming dry. A little cheese might melt over the top, but the dish did not depend on it. It was filling, reheated well, and could be served with bread, canned vegetables, or nothing more than the assurance that everyone had received enough. Then there was spaghetti night, when canned tomatoes helped American home cooks create sauces that range from carefully simmered family recipes to quick mixtures assembled after work. Some cooks began with whole canned tomatoes, breaking them apart with a spoon as they softened with onion, garlic, herbs, meat, or sausage. Others relied on tomato sauce and paste for speed and consistency. Prepared jarred and canned spaghetti sauces were available, but many households still built their own version from pantry ingredients, sometimes following an Italian-American family tradition, and sometimes following a recipe adapted through magazines, product labels, neighbours, or church cookbooks. Experiences differed enormously. A sauce that one family considered properly seasoned might seem sweet, mild, heavily meaty, or unusually thick to another. Yet the physical scene was widely recognisable: noodles boiling in one pot, red sauce bubbling in another, steam clouding the window, and a wooden spoon leaving a temporary path across the bottom. Spaghetti sauce also demonstrated how foods travelled and changed inside American households. Italian-American cooking had deep regional roots long before the 1960s, but expanding supermarkets packaged pasta, canned tomato products, restaurants, and popular recipes helped spaghetti become an increasingly familiar family meal, far beyond Italian communities. Home versions often adapted to local taste and budgets. Ground beef might replace other meats. Dried herbs replaced fresh ones. The sauce might cook for hours on Sunday or for 20 minutes on a weekday. Children learned to twirl noodles carefully or cut them into manageable lengths, while red drops landed on shirts, tablecloths, and any surface believed to be safely out of reach. The meal felt more adventurous than meat and potatoes in some homes, yet it remained affordable enough to become routine. A tomato can helped turn an international food tradition filtered through countless American adaptations into an ordinary school night supper. Canned tomatoes also entered vegetable soup, stuffed peppers, stewed dishes, casseroles, and skillet meals that never received a permanent name. A cook could pour them over cabbage, mix them with rice, add them to leftover beef, or combine them with whatever vegetables needed to be used. Tomato paste concentrated in its small can offered even greater intensity, though removing the final spoonful could require determination. Some cooks opened both ends and pushed the paste through. Others scraped the interior until the spoon made a metallic sound that suggested the can had nothing left to negotiate. These products saved washing, peeling and chopping fresh tomatoes, but they did not eliminate kitchen work. Someone still browned the meat, watched the pot, adjusted the seasoning, boiled the noodles and cleaned the red splashes from the stove. The can shortened the beginning. The family meal still needed a cook to carry it to the end. Canned tomatoes never vanished from the pantry. They remain basic ingredients because they're useful, affordable and more dependable for cooking than poor quality fresh tomatoes in many seasons. What changed was the range surrounding them. Prepared sauces multiplied, frozen meals became more common. Takeout expanded and fresh produce travelled farther throughout the year. Yet the old can still carries the memory of dinners that began without a detailed plan. Its lid curled beneath the opener, its juice stained the wooden spoon, and its contents transformed a small amount of meat or a box of noodles into a pot large enough for the family. Once that red sauce reached the table, another set of cans was usually waiting to complete the plate. Green beans, peas, corn, and mixed vegetables required even less imagination. Open, heat, season, and serve. The simplicity was real, though the children's opinion of the result remained much less predictable. The canned vegetable shelf often looked like a row of small promises that dinner would contain something green-yellow, or at least officially classified as a vegetable. Green beans, peas, corn, and mixed vegetables waited behind paper labels, each can heavy for its size and cool against the hand. In many 1960s kitchens, the choice was made only after the main dish had already begun cooking. A mother opened the pantry, studied the row for a moment, and selected whichever vegetable seemed least likely to cause an argument. The opener cut around the lid with a steady metallic turn. Then came the soft release of pressure, the splash of canning liquid, and the contents sliding into a saucepan. There was no washing, trimming, shelling, or waiting for a garden to cooperate. The vegetables were already prepared, already portioned, and ready to heat. Convenience had rarely looked so plain, which may have been why families depended on it so often without considering it remarkable. Canned green beans were among the most adaptable. They could be drained, heated with butter, seasoned with salt and pepper, or simmered with bacon, salt, pork, onion, or another flavouring tied to the family's region and traditions. Their texture was much softer than that of fresh green beans, and children who grew up with the canned version sometimes believed vegetables were naturally supposed to surrender at the touch of a fork. Other households preferred beans cooked slowly until they absorbed the flavour of meat and broth. Some served them almost directly from the can after heating, while others transformed them with sauces, seasonings, or a longer stay on the stove. Fresh beans from a garden and home-canned jars remained important in many rural and gardening households, so the supermarket can was never the only version of the story. But it provided predictability. It did not depend on season, weather, garden space, or the amount of preparation time left before supper. Green beans also demonstrated how a side dish could move toward casserole territory. Campbell's Test Kitchen had developed its famous green bean casserole recipe in the previous decade, combining green beans with condensed cream of mushroom soup and a crisp onion topping. By the 1960s, combinations of canned vegetables, condensed soup, and packaged toppings fit comfortably into the growing language of convenience cooking. Not every household served that particular casserole, and it had not yet become a universal holiday requirement. Still, the recipe expressed a larger pantry logic. Several ordinary products could be combined in one baking dish, and presented as something more deliberate than 3 cans standing separately on a counter. The beans supplied the vegetable, the soup supplied the sauce, and the topping supplied enough crunch to suggest that a special effort had been made. The oven supplied heat. The cook still supplied the dishwashing. Canned peas were more delicate in appearance and more controversial at the table. Their colour ranged from muted green to something closer to olive, and their soft texture could divide a family immediately. Some children chased them around the plate with a fork, flattened them into the mashed potatoes, or swallowed them in groups to finish the requirement more efficiently. Others liked their sweetness, especially when they were warmed with butter or folded into rice tuna casserole, chicken dishes or creamy sauces. Peas could also appear beside sliced meat as the small green portion expected to make the plate look balanced. They required almost no preparation, but they carried a strong dinner table expectation because the serving was small, surely it could be finished. The child receiving this argument understood that mathematical size and emotional difficulty were not the same thing. A spoonful of peas could occupy a very long 10 minutes. Corn usually had an easier relationship with younger diners. It was bright, mildly sweet and recognizable even after canning. Heated with butter, it could sit beside meatloaf, fried chicken, hamburger patties, or fish sticks without demanding much attention. It entered chowders, casseroles, cornbread mixtures and skillet suppers, while creamed corn offered a softer, sweeter variation that some families considered comforting and others regarded with suspicion. Canned corn was especially useful when fresh corn was out of season, or when no one had time to remove husks, clean silk from the ears, and wait beside a pot of boiling water. Yet fresh corn remained an important summer food in many regions, and frozen corn offered another convenient option. Families chose according to price, freezer space, local availability, and taste. The can's advantage was simple. It needed no refrigerator or freezer until it was opened, and the pantry could hold several without sacrificing valuable cold storage. Mixed vegetables offered both variety and the possibility that every child would find one component to dislike. A typical can might combine peas, diced carrots, corn, green beans, lima beans, or potatoes, although the contents varied by product. Poured into a saucepan, the pieces formed a small collection of colours and shapes that could become a side dish, enter vegetable soup, or disappear into a casserole or pot pie filling. Mixed vegetables were practical because one container replaced several separate ingredients. They could make a soup look fuller and help leftover meat become another meal. They also allowed the cook to place more than one vegetable on the table without opening multiple cans. The difficulty was distribution. One serving might contain mostly carrots, another several lima beans, and a third nearly all peas. Children noticed these differences with the attention of professional inspectors. A mother trying to serve equal portions could stir the pan carefully, but mixed vegetables had their own understanding of fairness. These cans mattered because the family dinner ideal often expected a main dish, a starch, and at least one vegetable even when the day had left little time for preparation. Canned vegetables helped complete that pattern. They stored well, were available throughout the year, and could be heated while the meat rested or the casserole finished baking. For families without gardens, large freezers, frequent shopping trips, or reliable access to fresh produce, the pantry shelf provided security. For other households, canned vegetables simply offered speed on busy nights. Their use varied across income levels, regions, and communities, and many families combined canned foods with fresh garden produce, frozen packages, home-preserved jars, and seasonal market purchases. The 1960s table was not divided neatly into fresh or canned. Most kitchens used whatever balance fit the budget, storage space, cooking traditions, and time available. Canned vegetables remain widely available, but their place on the plate changed as frozen selections expanded. Fresh produce became easier to obtain year-round in many areas, and prepared foods offered new forms of convenience. Their strongest memory may be less about flavour than routine. The can opener turning liquid draining into the sink, butter melting in a small saucepan, and a spoonful placed beside the main dish. Because dinner was expected to include a vegetable. Green beans, peas, corn, and mixed vegetables rarely received the attention given to fried chicken or cake. They simply completed the plate and supplied one more rule for children to follow before dessert. On the next pantry shelf, however, the cans held something sweeter. Peaches, pears, pineapple, and fruit cocktail could become a lunch plate, a gelatin ingredient or dessert merely by lifting the lid and deciding whether to keep the syrup. The canned fruit shelf brought a different kind of colour to the 1960s pantry. Instead of green beans and peas waiting for supper, these cans held peach halves, pear halves, pineapple rings, crushed pineapple and fruit cocktail packed in syrup or juice. The labels often showed fruit at its brightest, arranged more neatly than anything that had ever come out of an ordinary grocery bag. Once the opener cut through the lid, the kitchen filled with a sweet, concentrated smell, and the syrup rose close to the rim, ready to spill if the can was tilted too quickly. A mother could serve the fruit almost immediately, which gave it an advantage over desserts that required baking, chilling, or decorating. It was available in winter, dependable before grocery day, and already peeled, sliced, and softened. Fresh fruit still mattered greatly and varied by region and season, but canned fruit offered something the fruit bowl could not always guarantee, the same familiar sweetness whenever the pantry door opened. Peaches were among the most recognizable. A peach half could be placed in a small dessert dish with its curved side shining under the kitchen light, or sliced into smaller portions when one had to serve several people. Some families spooned peaches over cottage cheese for a luncheon plate, while others served them beside cake, ice cream, or a simple cookie. The syrup might be poured away, saved for another use, or spooned over the fruit according to household habit. Children often preferred the softer can texture because there was no skin, no pit, and little chance of biting into a hard or disappointing piece. Adults might remember fresh summer peaches as something better, but canned peaches had the advantage of being ready in February. They did not bruise in the grocery bag or become overripe overnight. They simply waited patient and golden until dessert needed to appear without asking the oven for assistance. Canned pears occupied a quieter place. Their pale halves were soft enough to cut with the side of a spoon, and mild enough to serve to children, older relatives, or anyone who wanted dessert without much argument. A pear half might rest on a lettuce leaf beside cottage cheese, mayonnaise, grated cheese, or another combination that belonged to the family's idea of a proper luncheon plate. Such presentations varied widely, and many households never assembled them at all. But the broader habit was familiar canned fruit could turn an ordinary midday meal into something that looked arranged rather than merely placed on a plate. The pear's gentle flavour also made it useful in gelatin desserts, fruit salads, and simple dishes where brighter ingredients might have taken over. It rarely demanded attention. It filled a small bowl, accepted a spoonful of syrup, and gave the meal a finished ending. Not every dessert needed frosting. Sometimes it only needed to be cold. Pineapple carried more personality. Rings, chunks, tidbits, and crushed pineapple could move from pantry shelf to holiday ham, gelatin, mold cake, batter fruit salad, or cottage cheese plate with surprising confidence. A ring placed over ham and secured with a cherry created the kind of decorative supper image that appeared in magazines, advertisements, and family photographs. Crushed pineapple disappeared into cakes, frostings, and chilled desserts, while chunks added sharp sweetness to fruit salads and gelatin. It was tropical packaged and visually distinctive, which helped it make an ordinary dish seem more modern. Yet pineapple also required attention in certain gelatin recipes, because fresh pineapple contains enzymes that can interfere with setting, while commercially canned pineapple has been heated during processing. Home cooks did not always discuss the chemistry. They simply learned which form worked from recipes, package instructions, or experience. The pantry can offer both flavour and predictability, two qualities every ambitious moulded dessert appreciated. Fruit cocktail was the most democratic can because it offered several fruits at once, although the distribution was not always equal. A spoonful might contain peaches, pears, grapes, pineapple, and a bright cherry fragment that immediately became the most valuable object in the bowl. Children noticed who received the cherry. Adults noticed too, though they were expected to behave with greater dignity. Fruit cocktail could be served plain folded into gelatin mixed with whipped topping, added to ambrosia-style dishes or spooned over cake. It gave the impression of variety without requiring the cook to open several separate cans. For a family gathering a church supper or a Sunday dessert, that efficiency mattered. The cook could drain it, combine it with other pantry and refrigerator ingredients, and produce a large bowl that looked festive. The fruit had already been cut into small pieces, so the most difficult step might be keeping curious children away from the cherries before the dish reached the table. Heavy syrup helped define the memory of many canned fruits, though products were also packed in lighter syrup or juice, and household preferences differed. The syrup preserved sweetness, added body, and made the fruit taste more like dessert than a plain side dish. It also made the can heavy and the opened rim sticky. A drop on the counter attracted fingers' dishcloths, and eventually everything else within reach. Some cooks diluted the syrup, drained it completely, or reserved it for gelatin, punch sauces, or other uses. Others served it with the fruit because pouring it away seemed wasteful. In homes where little was discarded casually, even the liquid received consideration. The can itself might be rinsed before disposal, while its lid was handled carefully because the sharp edge had no interest in family nostalgia. Convenience arrived with fewer preparation steps, but it still demanded a can opener, a bowl, a spoon, and respect for the metal rim. Canned fruit also carried social meaning. Fresh fruit could signal season, location, and access. Home canned fruit might represent a garden orchard family tradition, or days of preservation work. Commercial canned fruit represented reliability and supermarket convenience. It could be kept for unexpected guests, school lunches, sick days, or the final stretch before the next shopping trip. A mother could place several peach or pear halves in individual dishes and create dessert without announcing that the pantry was doing most of the work. At a time when meals were often expected to end with something sweet, canned fruit offered a practical compromise between baking a cake and serving nothing at all. It could also help make cottage cheese gelatin or plain sponge cake seem more generous. The transformation required no special skill, but presentation still mattered. A cherry in the centre, a spoonful of whipped topping, or a careful arrangement on lettuce could turn canned fruit into company food. Peaches, pears, pineapple, and fruit cocktail never completely disappeared. They remain on grocery shelves, although their cultural position changed as fresh fruit became more available throughout the year. Frozen fruit expanded and ideas about sweetness and convenience shifted. Many households now use canned fruit less frequently, or choose versions packed in juice. Yet the memory survives in the weight of the can, the syrup clinging to the spoon, the single cherry everyone noticed, and the glass dessert dishes brought out after supper. These fruits made the pantry feel prepared for both ordinary days and small celebrations. They waited without bruising, softened without ripening, and turned a plain meal into something sweet with almost no warning. Beside them stood a much smaller can with an entirely different purpose. Canned tuna carried no syrup and little glamour, but with bread noodles, mayonnaise, or condensed soup, it could stretch across lunch and dinner with remarkable efficiency. The tuna can look too small to solve a family meal, yet it often did more work than its size suggested. In many 1960s pantries, several short round cans waited behind the soup and vegetables, their labels promising solid chunk or flaked tuna packed in oil or water depending on the product and household preference. The opener circled the lid and a strong ocean smell escaped before the contents reached the bowl. Someone pressed the lid carefully against the fish to drain the liquid, keeping fingers away from the sharp metal edge. What remained was pale, compact, and ready to be separated with a fork. One can could become sandwiches for lunch, a salad plate for company, or part of a casserole large enough to reach every place at the dinner table. Tuna was not luxurious, but it was shelf-stable protein that required no thawing, trimming, or long cooking. When the refrigerator offered little help that mattered, tuna salad was the quickest transformation. The fish was broken apart and mixed with mayonnaise, then adjusted according to family custom. Chopped celery added crunch. Sweet pickle relish, chopped pickles, onion hard-cooked egg mustard or a little pepper might enter the bowl. Some cooks stretched the mixture with more celery or egg when several sandwiches had to come from one can. Others kept it plain because children could detect an unexpected onion fragment with remarkable accuracy. The finished salad went between slices of white or wheat bread, sometimes with lettuce if the refrigerator had it. Wrapped in wax paper and placed inside a lunchbox, the sandwich was filling and inexpensive, although its aroma could become more noticeable by noon. Adults carried tuna sandwiches to work. Children found them beside apples, cookies, crackers, or a thermos. The meal required no stove, but it still depended on someone remembering the mayonnaise bread and correct lunchbox before the morning became disorderly. At home, tuna salad could be presented more formally. A scoop might sit on a lettuce leaf beside sliced tomatoes, cucumber cottage cheese, canned fruit, or crackers. This kind of luncheon plate appeared in many forms, and was especially useful when a cook wanted to serve something cold, neat, and prepared before guests arrived. The plate could look light and orderly even though the ingredients came largely from cans, jars, and the refrigerator. A tomato cut into wedges supplied colour. A peach half or pineapple ring made the arrangement feel complete. Crackers filled the empty spaces. The cook had not roasted meat or heated the oven, but presentation turned a practical pantry meal into something suitable for a neighbour, relative club meeting, or quiet summer lunch. The tuna can offered convenience. The lettuce leaf provided ceremony. For some Catholic households and other families observing meatless meals, tuna became especially useful on Fridays or during certain religious seasons, though practices varied by denomination, family, and period. A can could replace meat in sandwiches, salads, patties, or casseroles without requiring fresh fish from a market. This did not mean every family served tuna for religious reasons, or that every Friday meal looked the same. Some households relied on eggs, cheese beans, macaroni, or locally available seafood. But canned tuna fit easily into the rhythm of a day when meat was avoided. It was familiar, widely usable, and capable of joining ingredients already in the pantry. A child might not have understood the theological reasoning behind supper, but he understood that the tuna casserole had returned and that the peas were once again hiding inside it. Tuna noodle casserole was where the small can displayed its greatest ability to stretch. Cooked egg noodles were mixed with tuna condensed cream soup milk, and often peas or another vegetable. The mixture went into a glass baking dish and received a topping chosen from crackers, bread crumbs, potato chips, or whatever the family recipe considered properly crisp. In the oven, the sauce bubbled around the edges while the topping browned. The finished casserole could feed several people from 1 or 2 cans of fish, a box of noodles, and pantry ingredients that had waited patiently for their assignment. It was soft, creamy, salty, and economical. It also combined several foods children might have accepted separately, and placed them into one dish where careful avoidance became much more difficult. The casserole was convenient for the cook. For the child sorting peas from noodles, it required advanced planning. The tuna can could also produce patties or croquettes. Drained fish was combined with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, egg onion seasoning, and sometimes a sauce or dairy ingredient to hold everything together. The mixture was shaped into small rounds and browned in a skillet. This method gave the fish a crisp exterior and made one can appear as several separate servings. Patties could be served with potatoes, canned vegetable salad, or a simple sauce. Recipes varied widely, and many were designed around thrift rather than strict tradition. The cook used what the pantry contained and adjusted the texture until the patties held their shape. Too wet and they softened in the skillet. Too dry and they broke apart during turning. A successful batch looked far more substantial than the opened can that had begun it. Canned tuna also reflected the growth of branded convenience foods. Familiar names and advertising helped make the product seem clean, modern, and dependable, while the sealed can allowed families far from the coast to keep seafood on the pantry shelf. Yet the household still had choices to make. Tuna packed in oil tasted and drained differently from tuna packed in water. Flaked fish mixed easily into salads and casseroles, while larger pieces could feel more substantial. Brand loyalty sometimes mattered, especially when texture, price, or flavor differed enough for a family to notice. Store brands offered savings. National brands offered familiarity. The shopper stood in front of several nearly identical cans and performed the same small calculation repeated throughout the supermarket: which one the family preferred, which one was on sale, and whether buying two now would prevent a more expensive trip later. The small tuna can never vanished, but its role shifted as refrigerated foods, frozen seafood, prepared lunches, takeout, and wider protein choices entered the household routine. Tuna salad and tuna casserole remained familiar, though they no longer appeared with the same regularity in every kitchen. Concerns about smell-changing tastes, school restrictions, and new meal habits altered where the sandwich travelled and how often the casserole reached the table. Still, the old memory remains distinct: the fork scraping fish from the can, mayonnaise folding into the bowl, wax paper tightened around a sandwich and cracker crumbs browning over noodles in the oven. Tuna stretched because it accepted help from everything around it. Bread made lunch, noodles made dinner, lettuce made company food. On the shelf behind it waited another compact can, this one filled not with fish, but with concentrated milk ready to make pies, sauces, casseroles, and coffee richer when the fresh bottle ran low. The evaporated milk can usually stood behind the fresh milk rather than beside it, waiting in the pantry for the day the bottle ran low, the weather turned bad, or a recipe needed more richness than ordinary milk could provide. It was shorter than many vegetable cans, heavy in the hand, and filled with milk that had been heated so that much of its water was removed before canning. When the opener pierced the top, the liquid poured out thicker and slightly darker than fresh milk, with a cooked aroma that made it easy to recognize. In many 1960s kitchens brands such as Carnation and Pet were familiar sights, although availability and preference varied by region. Evaporated milk was not the same as sweetened condensed milk, despite the two cans being confused often enough to ruin more than one recipe. One was unsweetened and useful across the meal. The other was thick with sugar and belonged to an entirely different plan. Its greatest advantage was simple: the unopened can did not need refrigerator space. That mattered in homes where the refrigerator was smaller, the freezer compartment was crowded with frost, and the weekly grocery trip required careful planning. Fresh milk disappeared quickly into cereal bowls, coffee cups, school lunches, puddings, and drinking glasses. A family could begin the week with several bottles or cartons and still discover by Thursday evening that only a pale inch remained. The pantry can offer insurance. Diluted with water, evaporated milk could substitute for fresh milk in many household uses, though the flavour was not identical, and children were often reliable judges of any change placed before them. More commonly, it entered cooking and baking, where its concentrated body was an advantage rather than something to disguise. Cream pies were one of its most memorable assignments. Pumpkin pie recipes often called for evaporated milk because it blended smoothly with eggs, sugar, spices, and pumpkin, while producing a firm, creamy filling. The can appeared on counters near Thanksgiving, but it was useful throughout the year in custard, pies, puddings, and other desserts. It went into the mixing bowl in a pale ribbon, while cinnamon, nutmeg, or vanilla filled the air. Because the milk was concentrated, it added richness without requiring cream, an ingredient that might have been more expensive, less available, or reserved for another purpose. A pie made with evaporated milk did not feel like an emergency substitute. It could be the expected family version, the one copied onto a recipe card and prepared every holiday without anyone considering another method. Savoury cooking gave the can even more work. Evaporated milk could enrich cream sauces, scalloped potatoes, macaroni and cheese soups, gravies, and casseroles. A cook might pour it into a saucepan after flour and fat had formed the base of a sauce, stirring until the mixture thickened and coated the spoon. In a casserole, it helped bind noodles, vegetables, cheese, or leftover meat into something that could be cut into portions. It could soften mashed potatoes, make chowder feel more substantial, or lend body to a dish when the refrigerator contained no cream. The flavour blended into the finished meal, leaving behind richness, rather than a clear announcement that canned milk had been used. This was pantry convenience at its most effective. The ingredient solved a problem without requiring the family to know that there had been one. Coffee provided a more visible use. In some households, a small amount of evaporated milk went directly into the cup, lightening the dark liquid and adding a fuller taste. A punched can might be kept covered in the refrigerator after opening ready for the next morning. The milk poured through one hole while another allowed air to enter, a simple arrangement that worked well until someone forgot which can had been opened or how long it had been standing there. Practices varied, and many families preferred fresh milk, cream-powdered creamers, or black coffee. Yet evaporated milk remained useful where tradition, economy, or habit favoured it. The can could also appear on the table with hot cereal or fruit, though its cooked flavour was more noticeable when it was not hidden inside a recipe. The can reflected the careful balance between preparedness and waste. Once opened, evaporated milk needed refrigeration and timely use, so a cook often planned several recipes around it. A portion might enter the potatoes at supper, another the next morning's coffee, and the remainder a pudding before it spoiled. Nothing about the can encouraged careless pouring. Its value came partly from shelf stability, but that advantage ended the moment the lid was pierced. Experienced cooks learned which recipes could share one can and how much remained by the sound and weight when it was lifted. A small amount left over could become sauce rather than being discarded. Pantry management was not only about keeping food in reserve, it was also about using the reserve intelligently once it was opened. Evaporated milk held different meanings in different households. For some families, it was an ordinary recipe ingredient with no association with shortage. For others, it was the dependable backup when fresh milk was expensive, unavailable, or consumed faster than expected. Rural families' households far from frequent shopping, and cooks working with limited refrigerator space could value it for practical reasons. Immigrant and regional food traditions also used canned milk in distinct dishes, desserts, beverages, and sauces. It should not be treated as one uniform middle-class habit. The same can might become pumpkin pie in one kitchen, coffee milk in another, and a creamy, savoury dish somewhere else. What joined those uses was the ability to store dairy safely before opening and bring richness to foods without relying entirely on the refrigerator. Evaporated milk never disappeared, but its place became less central. As refrigeration improved, supermarkets stayed open longer. Fresh dairy products became easier to replace quickly, and prepared sauces and desserts multiplied. Yet the can remains attached to powerful household memories. 2 triangular holes punched into the lid, a pale stream entering coffee. The label peeled back by a damp hand, and the last spoonful scraped into a pie filling, so nothing useful remained behind. It was not glamorous enough to sit at the front of the pantry, but it was dependable enough to deserve a permanent place there. Behind it waited another form of shelf-stable milk lighter, in weight, and far less subtle in flavour. Powdered milk could stretch a grocery budget, strengthen bread dough, or rescue breakfast when the fresh supply was gone, though children often recognised the substitution before anyone had finished explaining it. The powdered milk box was lighter than the cans around it, but its importance became obvious when the refrigerator shelf held an empty bottle, and breakfast was less than an hour away. In many 1960s pantries, non-fat dry milk waited in a cardboard package envelope or metal container ready to be mixed with water when fresh milk ran low. The powder was pale fine and slightly sweet-smelling, though it could form stubborn lumps if poured too quickly. A mother measured it into a pitcher, added cool water and stirred until the last floating islands disappeared. Chilling improved the results, so an experienced cook often prepared it before bedtime, rather than presenting a warm pitcher to sleepy children in the morning. Powdered milk solved a practical problem. It stored without refrigeration while dry took up less space than several bottles, and allowed the household to keep a dairy backup without making another trip to the store. Children, however, were not always impressed by the logic. Reconstituted milk could taste different from the fresh milk they expected, especially when it was mixed hurriedly served before it had chilled, or made stronger or weaker than the package directed. A child might lift the glass paws after the first sip and look across the table with the expression of someone who believed important information had been withheld. Some accepted it without complaint. Others detected the change immediately and began negotiations that delayed both breakfast and the school bus. Families sometimes blended powdered milk with fresh milk, so the supply lasted longer while the flavour remained familiar. This stretching method could be useful near payday, or during a week when several children had consumed more milk than the grocery plan allowed. The mother mixing the pitcher did not necessarily announce the arrangement. Breakfast had enough administrative difficulties already. Powdered milk was especially valuable because drinking it was only one of its possible uses. Added dry to bread dough, biscuits, pancakes, cakes, puddings, or other recipes, it supplied milk solids without requiring part of the fresh bottle. The cook could measure powder into the flour and add the necessary water separately or reconstitute it before mixing according to the recipe. In baked foods, sauces and casseroles, the distinctive flavour was usually less noticeable than it was in a drinking glass. This made powdered milk an efficient pantry helper. Fresh milk could be saved for cereal, children's cups, coffee, or the evening meal while the dry supply handled the baking. A box that caused suspicion at breakfast might quietly improve rolls or pancakes later in the day without receiving any objection. Like many pantry staples, it was most successful when nobody stopped to discuss it. The product also gave households greater protection against distance and disruption. Families living far from supermarkets could not always replace fresh milk quickly. Winter weather car trouble, illness work schedules, or a simple mistake in planning could turn an ordinary shortage into a problem. Powdered milk waited through those situations without souring. Rural homes, military families, large households, and families working within strict budgets could value it for different reasons, but no single experience represented everyone. Some people remember powdered milk as a normal baking ingredient. Others associate it with institutional meals, assistance programs, emergencies, or financially difficult periods. Still others rarely encountered it at all. The same box could suggest preparedness in one kitchen and hardship in another. Nostalgia becomes more honest when it leaves room for both memories. Mixing the milk correctly became its own small household skill. Water temperature mattered. Vigorous stirring helped, though it could also create foam that made the pitcher look fuller than it was. Lumps clung to the spoon or floated near the surface, resisting removal with surprising determination. Some cooks used a whisker jar with a tight lid or an electric blender when one was available. Others stirred patiently and trusted refrigeration to finish the work. The prepared milk had to be kept cold and treated like fresh milk once water was added. A pitcher might be covered with wax paper foil or a fitted lid and placed behind the leftovers where children were less likely to investigate it before morning. By breakfast, the flavour had usually mellowed. Whether it had mellowed enough remained a matter for the youngest person at the table to decide. Powdered milk also helped a mother manage the invisible flow of food through the house. Fresh milk disappeared into cereal cocoa pudding, mashed potatoes, sauces baking, and glasses poured for children who occasionally abandoned them after 3 sips. The dry reserve gave the cook options. She could make a white sauce without sacrificing the milk needed for breakfast. She could prepare pancakes when the bottle was nearly empty. She could increase the supply before relatives arrived, or before several children returned from school expecting cookies and milk. This was not always dramatic thrift. Often it was simply the work of preventing small shortages from becoming larger inconveniences. Pantry management depended on having substitutes understanding which uses mattered most, and knowing when the family would notice a change. By the end of the 1960s, powdered milk belonged to a broader world of packaged foods that promised security, economy, and easier storage. Advertising often emphasized convenience and nourishment, while household experience supplied a more complicated review. The product was undeniably useful. It was also difficult to disguise in a plain glass. Families developed their own solutions: chill it thoroughly, mix it with fresh milk, use it mainly for cooking, add it to cocoa, or reserve it for emergencies. A mother could appreciate the box even when her children did not. She understood that pantry staples were not chosen only because they were everyone's favorite. Some remained on the shelf because they were dependable when favorite foods were unavailable. Powdered milk never vanished, though improved refrigeration, easier shopping, shelf-stable, liquid milk, prepared baking mixes, and changing household habits reduced its visibility in many American kitchens. It remains useful in baking emergency supplies, commercial food production, and homes where long storage matters. Yet the strongest memory is often personal: a spoon striking the side of a pitcher, pale powder clinging to the rim, a glass placed beside a cereal bowl, and a child taking one careful sip before asking a question the mother had hoped to avoid. The box was light, inexpensive, and patient. It waited because someday the fresh milk would be gone, and the household would still need breakfast. Farther along the pantry shelf, several tiny foil-wrapped cubes offered a different kind of rescue. Dropped into hot water, they could make broth-strengthened gravy-seasoned rice, and suggest that dinner had been simmering far longer than the clock could honestly support. The bouillon cube was small enough to disappear beneath a stack of recipe cards, yet one foil-wrapped square could change the smell of an entire kitchen. In many 1960s, pantries' chicken, beef, or vegetable-flavoured cubes waited inside a jar box or paper packet near the salt and spices. Unwrapped, the cube looked hard, dry, and far too compact to have any connection with the simmering stock pot. Its surface could crumble against the fingers, leaving a salty dust on the foil. Dropped into hot water, however, it softened, broke apart, and coloured the liquid while a savoury aroma rose with the steam. The transformation took only minutes. A mother who had no bones simmering on the stove, no container of the homemade broth in the refrigerator, and no time to begin. Either one could still place a cup of seasoned liquid beside the cutting board and continue dinner, as though the recipe had always been under control. Broth made from a cube was not the same as stock slowly drawn from meat bones, vegetables, and hours of cooking. Experienced cooks knew the difference, even when advertisements preferred not to dwell on it. Homemade broth carried the flavour of what had actually entered the pot, and varied every time. Bouillon offered speed, concentration, and remarkable consistency. That consistency made it useful. A cube dissolved into water could begin soup when there was no chicken left from Sunday dinner. It could add depth to canned or frozen vegetables, strengthen a thin stew, or give leftover rice enough flavour to return to the table without seeming entirely unchanged. The cube did not create the complexity of an all-day simmer. It created the suggestion that someone had thought ahead, which on a busy afternoon could be nearly as valuable. Gravy was one of its most practical assignments. A skillet might contain only a small amount of meat drippings, not enough to season the quantity of gravy expected for potatoes, noodles, biscuits, or sliced meat. Flour thickened the liquid, but flour alone could not provide flavour. A dissolved bouillon cube helped extend what the pan had produced. The cook whisked it into the mixture, watching for lumps while scraping browned bits from the bottom. The gravy darkened, thickened, and began to coat the spoon. It could stretch a modest roast across several plates or make leftover meat feel less dry on its second appearance. The result depended on careful seasoning because bouillon was already salty. Adding the usual amount of table salt before tasting could leave the family reaching for water and wondering why the mashed potatoes had suddenly become so demanding. Rice also benefited from the little cube. Instead of cooking the grain in plain water, a mother could dissolve chicken or beef bouillon into the pot and create a side dish with more colour and flavour before adding a single piece of meat. Onion, celery, canned mushrooms, or leftover vegetables could turn it into something more ambitious. The same method worked with noodles, stuffing mixtures, casseroles, and skillet meals. Bouillon allowed a small amount of seasoning to spread through an entire dish, which made it useful when the pantry contained plenty of starch but little fresh meat. A cup of rice cooked in seasoned liquid could sit beneath chicken pieces beside vegetables or inside stuffed peppers and seem connected to the rest of the meal. Plain water filled the pot. The cube gave it a story. Soup was the most obvious destination, especially when the household needed something warm without beginning from scratch. Hot bouillon could receive egg noodles, rice, vegetables, dumplings, or small pieces of leftover chicken. It might be served in a cup to someone recovering from illness, or in a bowl with saltine crackers when appetite was limited. A single cube made only a modest amount, but several could begin a larger pot. The cook still had to add ingredients, judge the water, and control the seasoning. Bouillon provided a base, not a complete meal, yet the speed mattered. The pantry could produce broth before anyone had thawed meat, opened a soup can, or decided whether dinner was going to be formal enough to require plates. On a cold afternoon, the steam alone could make the kitchen feel better prepared. The foil wrapper became part of the memory. It crackled between the fingers and resisted opening neatly, especially when hands were damp. A corner tore, the cube crumbled, and several grains escaped onto the counter. Once empty, the bright square of foil was folded, crushed, or left beside the stove until clean-up. Different brands came in different packages, and some households preferred granules, Powders canned broth or homemade stock instead. Others relied heavily on cubes because they were inexpensive, compact, and easy to store. A box occupied little room and lasted through several meals. For cooks managing small kitchens, limited freezer space, or infrequent shopping trips that efficiency was difficult to ignore, the product promised flavor without storage trouble, although it also required the cook to remember that concentrated seasoning was not improved by adding twice as much. Bouillon cubes never disappeared, but their pantry role became less exclusive as canned broths boxed stocks. Seasoning bases, frozen concentrates, and prepared soups offered more choices. Some modern cooks use them regularly, while others reserve them for emergencies or avoid them in favor of homemade or lower sodium alternatives. In the 1960s kitchen, however, the cube represented a particularly efficient form of readiness. It could wait for months, then enter gravy rice soup noodles or casserole within seconds. Its flavor was direct, salty, and unmistakably convenient, but it helped a cook connect scattered ingredients into one meal. The foil was opened, the cube dissolved, and dinner acquired the aroma of time it had never actually been given. On another shelf waited a staple meant not for the supper pot but for the drinking glass. Tea bags could produce a hot cup during illness, a cold pitcher on a summer afternoon, or a regional argument over sugar before the first ice cube had finished melting. The tea bag was one of the lightest things in the 1960s pantry, yet a few small paper packets could fill an entire summer pitcher. They waited in a cardboard box near the coffee sugar and powdered drink mixes, each bag holding dark dry leaves behind thin filter paper with a string and tag hanging from one end. Drop one into a cup of hot water and the colour slowly spread outward, first amber around the edges and then deeper brown as the bag was lifted and lowered with a spoon. For a single cup the process was nearly effortless. For iced tea, several bags went into a saucepan kettle or heat-proof pitcher depending on family habit. Steam rose, the strings tangled, and the kitchen briefly smelled earthy and faintly bitter. Tea required fewer ingredients than lemonade and occupied almost no pantry space, but it still demanded judgment. Too little time produced coloured water. Too much produced a drink strong enough to make every sip feel instructional. Hot tea belonged to quieter moments. It might appear on a cold morning after supper during a visit with an older relative or beside someone who had gone to bed with a cold. A cup was placed on a saucer with a spoon sugar bowl lemon wedge or a little milk according to household preference. Coffee dominated the morning routine in many American homes, but tea offered a gentler alternative and a different kind of ceremony. The bag could be left in the cup until the drink became strong, removed almost immediately or squeezed against the spoon despite the possibility of dripping down the string. Children sometimes received weak tea with sugar lemon or milk when adults believed something warm would be comforting. Other families rarely served it hot at all. Tea habits reflected heritage, region, age, and personal taste, so the same pantry box could represent an everyday drink in one home and an emergency beverage for illness or unexpected company in another. Iced tea gave the bags their larger assignment. Water was brought to a boil, the tea was steeped strongly enough to survive dilution, and the concentrated liquid was poured into a pitcher with additional water and ice. Metal ice trays might have to be cracked open with a stiff lever releasing cubes that clattered into the glass pitcher and melted almost as quickly as they arrived. The tea changed from nearly black to clear amber as it cooled. Condensation formed on the outside, leaving a wet ring on the counter unless someone remembered a towel or trivet. A long spoon reached to the bottom for stirring while lemon slices floated near the surface. The pitcher could wait in the refrigerator for supper, a porch visit, yard work, or a hot afternoon when plain water seemed insufficient and soda was too expensive to serve without limits. One box of tea bags could refresh several people many times provided the ice supply cooperated. Sugar created the regional argument. In many southern households, sugar was stirred into the tea while it was still hot, so that it dissolved completely, producing the drink now closely associated with southern hospitality. The amount could be generous enough that the finished glass behaved almost like dessert. Yet even within the South, sweetness varied by family, community, and generation. Elsewhere, iced tea was often served unsweetened with sugar offered separately at the table. This arrangement seemed reasonable until someone tried to dissolve granulated sugar in a glass already crowded with cold tea and ice. The spoon circled the cubes knocked against the sides, and much of the sugar settled at the bottom, waiting to surprise the final sip. Some families preferred lemon but no sugar. Others added both. A visitor who assumed the pitcher was sweet could receive a shock, while one expecting plain tea might discover that the household had already made the decision for everyone. The pitcher carried its own household rules. It had to be strong enough to survive melting ice, but not so strong that children refused it. It had to cool before the refrigerator received it, yet supper would not wait indefinitely. Someone needed to refill the ice trays after emptying them, a task frequently performed only after the freezer contained no cubes at all. The last person taking tea was expected either to leave enough for someone else or begin another batch, though this expectation was not always communicated until after it had been broken. At a family gathering, picnic, church supper, or neighborhood meal, iced tea was practical, because it could be prepared in quantity and served from a pitcher beverage jar or large dispenser. Paper cups, tall glasses, lemon wedges, and a bowl of sugar completed the arrangement. The drink looked simple. The work of keeping it cold and available was less visible. Tea bags represented convenience, but not the kind that eliminated every step. Water still had to be heated. The tea still had to steep. Sugar had to dissolve before cooling if the family wanted a uniformly sweet pitcher. Ice had to be made, released, and replaced. The finished drink required refrigerator space, which could become scarce when casseroles, gelatin, molds, milk bottles, and leftovers were already competing for each shelf. A mother making iced tea in the morning was planning for heat that had not yet arrived and guests who might or might not appear. The dry bags made that planning possible because they kept well and took up almost no room. They could also be counted. 4 bags remained. That might be enough for another pitcher, but not if someone used 2 for hot tea first. Even a lightweight staple entered the pantry's quiet calculations. Tea survived every change around it. Instant tea, bottled drinks, powdered mixes, soft drinks, larger refrigerators, automatic ice makers, and restaurant refills changed how families encountered it, but the box of tea bags never disappeared. The old memory remains in the small physical actions, a paper tag hanging over the rim of a cup, a spoon pressing a dark bag against the side ice cubes cracking from a metal tray, and a glass pitcher leaving beads of water across the table. Tea could be hot or cold, sweet or plain, offered during illness or poured beside supper. Its recipe belonged partly to the package and mostly to the household. By the time the pitcher returned to the refrigerator, the pantry keeper had another task waiting. She had to look past the cans, bags, boxes, and nearly empty containers, decide what could still become dinner, and write the grocery list that would carry the family through the days before payday. The grocery list often began as a scrap of paper resting near the telephone held beneath a salt shaker, tucked beside the bread box or attached to the refrigerator with a magnet strong enough to support exactly 1 pencil. Throughout the week, items were added in different handwriting: milk bread, coffee, sugar, tuna flour, cereal. Some entries were complete words. Others were private abbreviations understood only by the person who would push the cart. Before payday, or the regular shopping trip, the list became more serious. A mother opened the pantry door, moved the brighter packages aside, lifted cans to judge their weight, and check the containers that could not reveal their contents without removing the lid. The question was not simply what the family wanted. It was what remained, what could be stretched, what would spoil first, and what the grocery money could replace. The pantry check turned a crowded shelf into an arithmetic problem with dinner attached. Nearly empty containers received special attention. Flour could look plentiful until the scoop reached the bottom. Sugar disappeared faster than expected because it left the canister one spoonful at a time. A peanut butter jar might still appear useful from the front while holding only a thin layer along the sides. Saltines could occupy an entire box even though the inner sleeve contained 6 crackers and several tablespoons of crumbs. The pantry keeper learned to distrust appearances. She shook the oatmeal canister, counted the tuna cans, checked whether the evaporated milk had been used, and looked behind the soup for anything pushed out of sight. A folded bag of rice could contain enough for 1 meal or 3, depending on how many people would be at the table and whether meat accompanied it. This inspection required memory as much as vision. She had to remember which items were already promised to future meals, and which ones were truly available. The days before payday often brought the pantry's most creative combinations. A can of tomatoes joined macaroni and a small amount of ground beef. Dried beans simmered with a bone saved from an earlier dinner. Tuna entered noodles with condensed soup, while canned peas supplied the required vegetable whether anyone had requested them or not. Rice stretched chicken pieces. Flour thickened gravy. Cornmeal completed a pot of beans. These meals were not always signs of severe hardship. In many homes, they were simply part of ordinary budgeting, the natural rhythm between larger grocery trips. But for families living close to the edge, the final days could carry real pressure. An empty shelf was not quaint, and thrift was not always chosen freely. The same casserole remembered warmly by one viewer may remind another of a week when money was short. The pantry held comfort and worry on the same shelf. The list on the counter helped turn that worry into order. Items were arranged mentally, if not on paper, according to the path through the store. Produce first in one supermarket, canned goods farther along, meat at the back, milk near the end, and bread placed where it would hopefully survive the trip home without being flattened beneath potatoes. A careful shopper knew which products the family insisted upon, and which could be replaced by a store brand when the price was better. She watched newspaper advertisements, clipped coupons, and noted weekly specials. In stores that issued trading stamps, the purchase could also add small paper stamps to a booklet intended for a household reward later. The stamps were useful only after someone carried them home moistened or pasted them into place, and resisted spending the completed books too quickly. Even the reward program created work before it created a toaster. The grocery list also reflected the limits of storage. A sale on frozen food meant little if the freezer compartment was already sealed behind frost and several unidentified packages. Fresh milk had to fit beside leftovers gelatin eggs and whatever casserole was expected for the next evening. Pantry goods offered more flexibility, but even shelves had boundaries. Buying several cans at a good price could protect the household against a future shortage, yet too many cans made it difficult to see what was already there. The reserve package was supposed to wait behind the open one, but busy family members did not always respect this arrangement. 2 boxes might be opened at once. A fresh jar appeared while the older jar still held several servings. Pantry order was less a permanent condition than something restored repeatedly by the person who cared enough to notice. Children sometimes participated in the inspection, though their priorities differed. They noticed the missing cookies, the nearly empty cereal box, and the absence of the snack they had seen advertised. The mother noticed that flour coffee and canned tomatoes were low. A child's proposed grocery list could contain several kinds of sweetness, and no ingredient capable of becoming supper. The adult list had to balance requests with actual meals, breakfast before school-packed lunches, dinners, weekend baking, and something ready when an unexpected guest appeared. Saying no in the supermarket often began here at the counter, before anyone saw the bright cereal boxes or candy near the register. The budget had already assigned each dollar a purpose. Advertising would spend the shopping trip trying to persuade it otherwise. When the list was finished, it represented more than missing food. It contained a plan for the coming week. Condensed soup meant a casserole or quick lunch. Peanut butter meant sandwiches. Flour meant biscuits, gravy, or baking. Rice and beans meant dependable portions. Canned vegetables completed plates, while canned fruit supplied dessert without another trip. Tea bags covered hot afternoons, and powdered or evaporated milk waited behind the fresh supply. The list connected pantry objects to future hours, rushed morning school lunches, Tuesday supper, Friday without meat in some homes, Saturday baking, Sunday company. Many of those meals would change before they happened. Someone would work late, a child would refuse a dish, leftovers would last longer than expected, or a visitor would appear. Still writing the list made the week seem manageable. After the shopping trip, paper bags landed on the counter and the pantry was filled again. Older cans moved forward when the system was working. New bags were folded shut. Flour and sugar were poured into canisters, and the grocery list was discarded or turned over for another use. The shelves looked secure for a few days, though the process had already begun again. Milk would disappear, crackers would crumble. The last can of soup would be opened without anyone adding it to the list. Pantry management had no true ending because feeding a household created tomorrow's shortages while solving today's hunger. One staple, however, was often checked with particular urgency. If the coffee tin felt too light, the morning routine itself was in danger. Before breakfast, before school lunches, and before the next grocery list began, ground coffee and the percolator helped start the entire house. The coffee tin usually announced the morning before anyone had opened the curtains. It sat near the stove, large enough to require both hands when full, and light enough to cause concern when only a thin layer of grounds remained at the bottom. In many 1960s, kitchens ground coffee came in a metal can with a fitted lid carrying familiar names such as Folgers, Maxwell House Chase, and Sanborn, or a regional or store brand preferred for its price and flavour. When the lid came free, the smell rose immediately, dark, roasted, slightly bitter and strong enough to make the kitchen seem awake even when the people inside it were not. A measuring spoon disappeared into the grounds while water was poured into the percolator. No one needed to consult the clock closely. The sound would soon begin, and once it did, the entire house understood that breakfast had officially started. The stovetop or electric percolator created a rhythm that belonged to the decade. Water heated in the lower chamber rose through a narrow tube and passed over the coffee grounds held in a metal basket. At first, there was only a low murmur. Then the liquid began to bubble into the clear glass knob on top, growing darker with each cycle. The perking sound was steady and domestic, somewhere between a simmer and a quiet mechanical conversation. A mother preparing breakfast could hear it while turning bacon, packing lunches, buttering toast, or calling toward the hallway that someone needed to get dressed immediately. The coffee did not require constant stirring, but it did require timing. Left too long, it could become harsh and overcooked. Removed too early, it might look dark enough while tasting as though the water had merely been introduced to the grounds and then moved on. For many adults, the first cup was less a luxury than part of the household operating system. It arrived before the school bus, the work commute, the grocery list, and the first disagreement over who had used the last clean spoon. Coffee was poured into sturdy cups sometimes with a matching saucer, sometimes into a favourite mug that had survived years of cabinet rearrangements. Sugar came from the bowl on the table. Fresh milk evaporated milk cream, or a powdered creamer lightened the cup according to preference and availability. One adult drank it black and hot. Another added enough sugar to turn it into something closer to breakfast dessert. A second cup might be poured before the first was finished, especially if the morning involved several children and only one bathroom. The coffee warmed the hands-filled pauses in conversation and gave adults a few quiet minutes before the day began asking questions. The tin also belonged to hospitality. An unexpected visitor could be offered coffee before anyone had determined how long the visit would last. A neighbour arriving through the kitchen door, a relative stopping after church, or a repairman working near the house might hear the familiar offer. Putting on a fresh pot was a small act of welcome, economical enough for ordinary company, and formal enough to prevent the guest from feeling ignored. Coffee appeared beside pie cake cookies, sweet rolls, or nothing at all. At church meetings, club gatherings, funeral receptions, and community events, larger urns performed the same duty for a crowd. The drink gave people something to hold while conversation began. It filled the silence after plates were cleared and made a kitchen table suitable for news, gossip, budgeting, condolences, and decisions that seemed easier to discuss with steam rising between the cups. Ground coffee required its own pantry calculations. A full tin suggested that the week was secure. A tin that sounded hollow when lifted needed immediate attention. Running out of flour might change a baking plan. Running out of coffee could change the mood of breakfast itself. The shopper watched for sales, compared national brands with store labels, and sometimes bought a larger can because the price per serving was better. Yet flavour mattered. Families developed loyalties based on strength, aroma habit, and what the local store consistently carried. Instant coffee also had a place in many homes, offering speed when only one cup was needed, or when no one wanted to wash the percolator. Some adults accepted it readily. Others considered it useful only under circumstances that should not be discussed before the first proper cup. The pantry could contain both one for routine and one for emergencies. Once empty, the coffee tin often began another career. Its metal body and tight lid were too useful to discard without consideration. A rinsed can might hold bacon grease nails, screws, clothespins, buttons, cookie cutters, crayons, pet food, or small kitchen tools. In a garage or basement, the original label could remain long after the coffee smell disappeared, the can now filled with hardware that made a different kind of rattle. This reuse connected the coffee tin to the broader household habit of saving jars, boxes, paper bags, foil, and sturdy containers. Packaging was not evaluated only at the supermarket. It had to prove its usefulness again after the food was gone. A can designed to preserve coffee from air and moisture became equally capable of organizing objects that otherwise had nowhere to belong. The pantry supplied breakfast, then quietly supplied storage. By the end of the 1960s, coffee habits were already changing. Instant varieties offered greater convenience. Electric drip machines would become more common in later years, and changing work schedules altered how and where the first cup was consumed. Yet the ground coffee tin and percolator remained powerful household symbols because they were attached to repetition. The same lid opened every morning. The same spoon measured the grounds. The same dark liquid appeared while toast browned. Oatmeal thickened and lunch boxes waited on the counter. Coffee marked the beginning of adult work long before the family left the house. Someone had to rise first heat the water, prepare the food, inspect the pantry, and notice what was missing. The aroma drifting down the hallway was comforting, but it was also evidence that the day's labour had already begun. That coffee tin brings the pantry journey back to where it started, a cabinet filled not with glamorous foods but with possibilities. Condensed soup could become sauce, peanut butter and crackers could become lunch, Flour, sugar, salt, leavening and shortening could become biscuits or pie. Cornmeal, oats, rice, beans and noodles could stretch the budget across another meal. Canned tomatoes and vegetables supplied dinner. Canned fruits supplied something sweet, tuna supplied protein, and shelf-stable milk waited behind the fresh bottle. Bouillon added the flavour of thyme tea cooled the afternoon, and coffee started the morning. Not every 1960s household kept all 25 staples, and no two families used them in exactly the same way. Region, income, heritage, religion, family size and local stores shaped every shelf. What these foods shared was their quiet usefulness. They waited through busy days and difficult weeks until someone opened the pantry and decided what the household could make from what remained. Some of these packages have changed. Some ingredients are used less often, and others remain as ordinary as ever. But the memory of the pantry is rarely just about food. It is the sound of a can opener, the flour ring beneath a canister, the sticky edge of a syrup, the coffee perking before sunrise, and a grocery list written by someone who knew how quickly everything disappeared. The shelves were stocked with cans, sacks, boxes, jars, and tins, but they also held planning, adaptation, and the repeated work of making sure the family could sit down to another meal. By evening, the paper grocery bag had been folded for reuse, the dishes had been cleared, and the pantry door had closed again. Inside, the remaining staples waited in the dark, already preparing to become tomorrow.